Good morning, everyone. This is the second day of the 4th Arizona Women's History Symposium, and I want to welcome you. We've got a really interesting lineup of speakers today. Before I turn this over to Mary Melcher, I just wanted to give a shout out to the Arizona Humanities. They are the funders of the symposium, and we're very grateful for that. So, Mary?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad you're here today because we have a very good speaker, Kathleen D. Cahill. I'm going to introduce her. I also wanted to let you know that I serve on the board of the Arizona Women's History Alliance. Kathleen is a social historian who explores the everyday experiences of ordinary people, primarily women. She focuses on women's working and political lives, asking how identities such as race, nationality, class, and age have shaped them. She is the author of Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2013. This book won the Labriola Center American Indian National Book Award and was a finalist for the David G. Weber and Bill Clements Book Prize. Her most recent book is Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. It's also published by the University of North Carolina Press just last year, and she'll be drawing from this book today. It tells the powerful stories of a multiracial group of activists who propelled the national suffrage movement toward a more inclusive vision of equal rights. Kathleen Cahill teaches at Penn State and serves as the steering committee chair for the Coalition for Western Women's History. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you, Mary. It's really lovely to be here with you all this morning, and thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to share my work. I wanted to add to my biography that I taught at the University of New Mexico for 13 years before coming here to Penn State. So I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person in the Southwest. I miss it a lot. But what I thought I'd do today is, as Mary said, give you a little bit from my book, Recasting the Vote, but I'm gonna really focus on New Mexico. And, it's interesting to think about it in comparison with Arizona. And so what I'm gonna do is pull up my PowerPoint here. So, as I said, the focus will be on New Mexico. And what I thought I'd do is start with a suffrage fact about New Mexico. So according to the historian Joan Jensen, in 1910, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, the main national organization, had only 2 women on its subscription list for New Mexico. One of them had a notation next to her that said dead, and the other woman was in the Silver City Tuberculosis Sanatorium. So that was 1910. A decade later, New Mexico would become the 32nd state to ratify the 19th Amendment. So the question is, why the sudden shift? What happened in those 10 years? Well, one of the answers is that the national sort of strategy for suffrage shifted to a focus on a national amendment. But also, I argue that in New Mexico, suffrage couldn't have been successful without the cooperation of Spanish-speaking women. And what I'll talk about that quite a bit in the talk, but I'll also show that even in New Mexico, where there was a great deal of cooperation between women of different groups, there was still the pall of racial prejudice that marred other sections of the country, but was also somewhat unique to New Mexico. Let me start with just a quick illustration, and we'll stay in Silver City for a minute. So the Nassau member who was in the sanatorium might have still been there in 1911 when the College Tuberculosis Sanatorium decorated a float for the local 4th of July parade that mocked suffrage. So it's hard to, I'm sorry about the picture quality, but this picture shows that there's a group of men from the institution who are dressed as suffragettes, which was a derisive term, in dresses and bonnets, complete with a sign demanding votes for women. And there's another sign that unfortunately you can't read, so you have to trust me, that describes them as Bullock's Indians. And this referenced Dr. Bullock, who was the head of the sanitarium, but also suggested an increasingly familiar trope of linking suffragists with wild Indian women, right? And this was a critique of both Native women, that they were uncivilized, but also of suffragists as unwomanly and violent. And this is an example of how anti-suffragists portrayed women, but it also reminds us that race was often in people's minds when they were talking about women's suffrage. So they were talking about gender, but they were also talking about race. And we'll come back to that. The other thing that I'm sure you don't need to be convinced of, but some people, particularly here in Pennsylvania, do, is that we need to tell our Western stories, right? That they give us a different vision from the usual suffrage stories that tend to focus on the East. The West and the Southwest are often afterthoughts at best. So what happens when we refocus our lens in a place like New Mexico or Arizona? On one hand, their experiences were unique, but New Mexico offers an excellent example of the diversity of experiences among women around the question of suffrage and voting rights. So before we leave this map, I want to point out, and again, you probably know this, but almost all of the states in the West had fully enfranchised women before 1920. New Mexico, as you can see there, is actually one of the exceptions. It has school suffrage, which is why it's gray, but it does not have full suffrage. So I'm going to start in 1910. And in 1910, New Mexicans were in the midst of their bid for statehood and busy creating a new constitution. So the US Census for that year, as you can see here, noted that the majority of people in New Mexico were Hispanos or Nuevo Mexicanos, right? And most of them were Spanish speaking. Many of them were descended from people who'd become US citizens under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that treaty, however, had not made Native Americans citizens, even though they had been former Mexican citizens. Instead, the United States treated them as domestic dependent nations. And actually, after the Civil War in the 1870s, that status was really changing. In 1871, the United States decides to stop signing treaties with Native people and stops recognizing tribal governments and begins to actually think of and assert that Native people are wards of the government, right? And a ward has no political rights. They can't make their own independent decisions. So going back to Spanish speakers, oh, actually, and I just want to point out the very small number of Asians. I'll mention that again later, but a really tiny percentage. So in New Mexico, the arrival of the railroad in the 1880s did bring more Anglos into the territory, but Spanish speakers maintained their demographic advantage and were politically powerful, and certainly up through statehood in 1912. And many of the politicians in the state were Spanish speakers. So I'm going to go back to that, sorry. The rest of the country, however, had a lot of reservations about the population in New Mexico. And I think Arizona was kind of familiar with some of this, right? These Spanish speakers were seen as too foreign and too Catholic for much of the rest of the nation. And in fact, in the Enabling Act that would allow New Mexico to apply for statehood, Congress had stated that their constitution should include English-only provisions, particularly that office holders should be proficient in English and public school instruction should be English only. So language and religion and suffrage were all questions that were addressed at the state constitutional convention, and Spanish-speaking women played a role in those debates along with Anglo women. So now we'll go to this slide. One of those women was Nina Otero Warren. You can see her on the right. She was from a prominent political family. Her uncle, Miguel Otero, had been appointed territorial governor by President McKinley. And her maternal, sorry, that was her cousin. Her maternal uncle, Solomon Luna, played a major role in the New Mexico Constitutional Convention. But despite being very politically powerful, her family still felt the effects of US takeover and dispossession and violence that came with it. So for example, her father had been murdered by Anglos in a land dispute when she was about 5 years old. She ends up living in Santa Fe. Her stepfather had gotten a political position in the capital, and so she's living there right in the center of politics. Another Nuevo Mexicana, Aurora Lucero, who's on the left, was the daughter of a newspaper editor and politician, Antonio Lucero, who would become the first Secretary of State when New Mexico entered as a state. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, she was a young college student at the New Mexico Normal School in her hometown of Las Vegas, New Mexico. And she enters a speech contest where she gives a winning oratory entitled, "Shall the Spanish Language Be Taught in the Schools of New Mexico?" Or, as the Spanish language papers reported it, Defensa de Nuestro Idioma. And it was a direct response to that Congressional Enabling Act. And you see the two articles here. It powerfully argued for the importance of Spanish language culturally and politically, not just in New Mexico, but across the nation. And it was reprinted again throughout the territory and even into El Paso. And some historians credit her as really influencing the members of the Constitutional Convention. And indeed, they made sure to include protections for Spanish language and for freedom of religion. And that was particularly to protect Catholicism. And here's the sort of relevant section, section 3. You'll note it says the right to vote shall never be restricted, abridged, or impaired on account of religion, race, language, or color, or inability to speak, read, or write the English or Spanish languages. Right? It also goes on to say, except as may otherwise be provided for in this Constitution. So it's very protective of certain things, but then there are exceptions. And when they say that, they mean two particular things. One is that Indians not taxed, so Native people living in their nations, were excluded from the vote by Article 7 of the Constitution. And secondly, women were the other exception, and their voting was limited. So the men who were writing this Constitution had considered women's suffrage, and they had been lobbied by the New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs, which had just been formed the year before. Most of the members were Anglo, but in Santa Fe in particular, there were a number of Hispanas, including Nino Tarawarn. And they lobbied the men, but ultimately the men of New Mexico decided that only women could only have school suffrage, right? And even this was pretty contingent. So they could vote in elections about education, and they could also run for educational offices, so county superintendent of schools or school boards. But again, contingent. They voted in separate elections on different dates than regular elections. And if the majority of the men in their county decided they no longer wanted women to vote, they could petition to take that right away. So in this section here, they protected the right of Spanish-speaking Catholic men to vote. And then they made it extremely difficult to change provisions of the Constitution that addressed voting. So unless 3/4 of the electors voting in the whole state, and then 2/3 of the people voting in each county voted to change the Constitution, it wouldn't change. They couldn't amend it. And that's an incredibly high bar, right? So it meant that the fight for women's suffrage at the state level through the state legislature in New Mexico was really stymied. Also, right, NASA, that main national organization, was really focused at this moment, 1910 through 1912, at state by state strategies, right, and getting sort of state legislators to change the law. So this was of little help to New Mexican women. So that changes in 1913. When young activist Alice Paul, who had spent time in England with the suffragists there, returned to the United States determined to shake up what she saw as a stale movement. And she wanted to return to the strategy of focusing on a national amendment, which had been abandoned after the 1870s. And she famously announces this strategy with the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. It was the first national protest parade in the nation's capital. The women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration and brought national attention to their cause. It was said that every state was represented in the march, but I haven't found evidence that women from New Mexico were actually there. Potentially women connected to the congressional delegation might have marched, and certainly someone probably carried a sign, like you see in the bottom right, The other Western states were represented. The picture in the top left is probably a parade from New York City that same year, but you can see that women from the West did go to some of these national parades. So when organizers from Alice Paul's organization, which was first known as the Congressional Union and later the National Women's Party, when they came to New Mexico to recruit members, they found New Mexican women really interested in this strategy of a national amendment. So both Nina Otero Warren and Aurora Lucero became leaders in the movement in New Mexico. They emphasized that suffrage could not succeed in New Mexico if the Spanish-speaking women were not part of the movement. They insisted that literature needed to be bilingual, and the National Women's Party organizers who came were generally open to this. Only one was not, and one New Mexican suffrage leader wrote that organizer, it was the first one they sent, quote, was a Texas Democrat and should not have come into a Republican state, end quote. And this suggests that the white supremacist leanings of Southern Democrats at the time was a concern in New Mexico. And indeed, they were very aware of the expansion of Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised and segregated African Americans and Mexican Americans in Texas, right? And in fact, Republican politicians, especially in northern New Mexico, often drew a contrast between their state and Texas. So these the next organizers that the National Women's Party sent wisely incorporated Spanish-speaking women, Nina Otero Warren and Aurora Lucero in particular. In 1915, the National Women's Party sent an organizer named Ella St. Clair Thompson to New Mexico. And she, again, was very open to working with Spanish-speaking women. And in fact, she spoke some Spanish herself. She wrote, quote, very little, but it helps a lot, when she wrote to Alice Paul. So again, they worked together to print literature in Spanish, to emphasize topics such as child welfare that would appeal to Hispanic women. And she said, quote, they say it is very difficult to get the Spanish ladies out, but as I have one on the program to speak in Spanish, I think they will come, and their husbands as well. And they did. This was a good strategy. When Thompson visited in October of 1915, the women of Santa Fe organized a suffrage parade. 150 women, Anglo and Hispana, marched throughout the city. Some rode in decorated automobiles, and hundreds of people turned out to watch as they marched through the streets, making this statement in support of women's rights. They concluded their march here, this is a picture of them, at the house of US Senator Thomas Catron, a notorious anti-suffragist. You see him there in the photo. They had designated 4 women as speakers, 2 Anglo women and 2 Spanish-speaking women, who formally asked the senator to support the federal amendment when he returned to Washington, D.C. So he politely greeted them and he listened to their speeches, and then he began to explain why suffrage was bad. Some might use the contemporary word mansplain. He used a series of familiar anti-suffrage arguments that men and women were different and women weren't suited to politics. And in fact, politics desexed women when they were involved with it. He also pointed to anti-suffragist women to say, here's proof that women don't actually want the right to vote. And significantly, he also raised an issue that his Southern colleagues in Congress were concerned about. And I'm going to show you a slide that has some difficult language on it, so just be aware. This is a handbill from Georgia from just about a year later. He said, what about Black women who will get the vote if women are enfranchised? And you can see here that with the bottom line, people in Georgia were against this, quote, because white supremacy must be maintained. Okay. So the National Women's Party organizer, Thompson, assured him that Black women would not be a problem. There was, quote, no danger of the Negro complicating the situation, end quote, because Southern state laws that disenfranchise Black men would apply to Black women as well. And this was generally the position of the national organizations, which was to allow for a quote unquote states' rights approach where state organizations could decide, suffrage organizations could decide if they wanted to allow Black women to participate or not, and that state organizations could advocate, right, that they didn't want African Americans to vote if they were from the South. They hoped that this would win them the support of Southern congressional legislatures, but it didn't really. It was also a stance that might not have been reassuring to the Black women of New Mexico. So in 1917, another organizer, Doris Stevens, came to New Mexico and helped establish an official branch of the National Women's Party in New Mexico. The women elected officers and came up with a constitution. And they initially elected Nina Otero Warren as vice chair of the state organization. But a few months later, the chair stepped down and Alice Paul asked her to lead New Mexico's National Women's Party branch. And she agreed, writing to Paul, quote, "I am with you now and always." So she was really busy at this time. The New Mexico Board of Education had appointed her interim superintendent of schools for Santa Fe County. And the next year, she actually ran for that office, defeating a male opponent. And this was her first campaign experience, but it proved to observers that she was up to the challenge. And she holds that position for the next 12 years. So she's working full time. That same year, 1917, New Mexicans send Democrat Andreas Orestius Jones, or A.A. Jones, to the Senate. And in the Senate, he is made chair of the Women's Suffrage Committee. And until that committee voted the amendment out of committee and allowed it to move forward for a vote in the Senate, it wasn't going to go anywhere. The Albuquerque Journal found this assignment really amusing, and their headline was, quote, "New senator to become most popular gentleman in Washington with workers for the Anthony Amendment." And the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was the nickname for the 19th. Jones brought with him his campaign interpreter and former future senator of New Mexico, Dennis Chavez. And Chavez became a clerk in the Senate while going to night school at Georgetown. Chavez's wife, Yamelda Espinoza Chavez, also moved to the Capitol, and she took a job at the Commerce Department. And all of them had front row seats to the climatic battle to get the national amendment passed through Congress. As chair of the committee, Jones is right at the center of it. He's often lobbied by Maud Wood Park of NASA, who would later become the president of the League of Women Voters. Nina Otero Warren also lobbied Jones as his constituent from New Mexico. And over the next few years, she visited Washington several times, where she met and strategized with Alice Paul, and also, again, lobbied the New Mexico delegation. Now, we know that during the war, Alice Paul's National Women's Party began to picket the White House, right, famously, which earned her criticism and the reputation of being very radical. But other suffragists, including NASA, emphasized women's participation in war work and their patriotism. And in New Mexico, the women, even though they were part of the National Women's Party, actually were really involved in war work. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So in 1919, the House of Representatives first passed the amendment, and then the Senate followed in June. And New Mexico's suffragists were really proud of their congressional delegation. They had all voted for the amendment. And Nina Otero Warren was put in charge of planning a, quote, suffrage jubilee in Santa Fe to celebrate its passage, and then rally the forces, right, for ratification, because passing Congress was just the first step. Now you had to get enough states to ratify it. And so national suffragists continue to come through. Carrie Chapman Catt came through on a Southwest tour in 1919. She is anticipating success. Her speech is "The League of Women Voters and Why." And in another speech, she talked specifically about the Spanish-speaking women of New Mexico and their role in a post-war world, talking about how their knowledge of Spanish would be really influential in the US's presence in the Western Hemisphere. So, although suffrage organizations were nonpartisan, Otero Warren also was anticipating that women would soon win the vote, and she moved to ensconce herself in party politics. The men in her family, as I said, were powerful Republican leaders, and she planned to join them in the top ranks of the party. So she steps down as chair of the National Women's Party and moves into the position of chair for the New Mexico GOP State Women's Committee. And that committee was formed to help women start taking an active part in politics. So as New Mexico came to consider ratifying the amendment, she still was involved in that process, despite having moved out of the chair position. She served on the state committee for ratification of the amendment and urged the men to support it. And in New Mexico, there was a sense that this was going to go through, that there was support for it, it was going to be pretty easy, and that they'd be taking action. But at the last second, there was a bolt by some of the state legislators who decided to put on the brakes. As one headline put it, quote, "Suffrage totters on edge of defeat by pledge breakers." And Otero Warren and the suffragists in Santa Fe redoubled their efforts. I want to come back to Texas for a second here. So this is happening in 1920. New Mexico has a special session for ratification. And the day before there's going to be a vote, this advertisement appeared in the Santa Fe New Mexican, and it's chastising New Mexican men for suddenly going back on their word. And it holds up the example of Jim Crow Texas as the opposite of New Mexico. And it suggests that race prejudice will hurt Spanish-speaking women. What's interesting is Texas had actually ratified the amendment in June of 1919. So it's suggested in this ad that they didn't. But in Texas, white suffrage leaders had explicitly set up a contrast between white women and immigrant men, and especially German immigrants and Mexican immigrants. And that was their argument for why white Texas women needed to vote. What's also interesting is there's a pretty callous discussion of the African-American women in New Mexico. So this ad asks if New Mexico Republicans are going to line up with southern states, including Mississippi and Alabama, in refusing to enfranchise women. If so, the ad warned, the state's Republicans would become, quote, "a howling joke nationally." The opposition of Southerners to women's suffrage was, as we've seen, based on their desire to deny Black women the vote, which is this ad asserts. And while the author kind of acknowledges that this is a backwards position, it also urges New Mexico's men to protect the state's women, but presumably they mean Anglo and Hispanic women, from being treated like African-American women. Quote, "Is the opposition in New Mexico afraid to give the ballot to the 100 or 2 Negro women resident in New Mexico? Or does it class all of the womanhood of New Mexico on par with the Negro woman of the South?" End quote. So it's playing on Hispanic fears that white Southern migrants from Texas will bring Jim Crow policies to New Mexico and deploy them against Nuevo Mexicanos. And in fact, as you see from the headline, is New Mexico going to line up with Texas? Right, it's playing on the fear that Texas stands for white supremacist politics. And the author concludes by chastising wavering politicians, warning them that if they violate their pledge, they were, quote, "making a politically boneheaded play and courting political ruin, as well as slapping in the face the splendid women of New Mexico." So there's this last minute scramble, and Nina Otero Warren's right in the thick of it. Along with her Republican male allies, she is whipping up the votes. As head of the women's division of the Republican Party, she caucuses with legislators in their closed door session and fiercely argues for support of ratification. And she's successful. And so New Mexico becomes the 32nd state to ratify out of the necessary 36. So without the support of Spanish-speaking women and Spanish-speaking politicians, that amendment might not have succeeded. So the women of New Mexico watched very closely as the amendment then moved to other states, and they need 4 more to ratify to have the, quote, perfect 36. And that doesn't come until late summer of the following, of 1920, when on August 18th, Tennessee's House passes it by 1 vote, right? So this comes down to the wire. In New Mexico, the news was met with celebrations, but there was an election just a few months off. And so women quickly set up clubs to sort of talk about how to register to vote and how to think about the issues. And again, in the lead up to the election of 1920, campaign literature continued to be bilingual. And here's an example of that. Also, like Nina Otero Warren, women moved quickly into the political parties. I mentioned her, but the Democrats also quickly appealed to newly enfranchised women. You can see here The Democratic State Central Committee hired a number of women to serve as speakers around the state. You can see a couple of itineraries. As far as I can tell, these are all Anglo women. And the chairman of the Democratic Speakers Bureau in Santa Fe wrote to a member in Alamogordo saying, quote, "We sincerely hope that everything is being done to interest Democratic women voters of your county. The Republican women up this way are thoroughly interested, and every one of them will vote on election day. We must win this election, and this result can only be obtained by every Democratic woman voting on election day." So in their effort to mobilize these newly enfranchised women voters, both parties catered to policies they thought would appeal to women. So one of the first ones is, remember that women could, well, maybe I didn't mention this, but in the state constitution, it's explicitly stated that women could only hold offices for educational elections, right? So the superintendent and school boards. It says that only men can hold the other offices. So each party supported changing that in a special election in 1921. And it was easier to amend other parts, the non-voting parts of the Constitution. So that passes quite easily, and it has the support of both parties. I want to mention one other amendment that passes in that 1921 special election, which was one preventing, quote, "aliens who are ineligible to citizenship from owning land or leasing land." And this meant, quote, Asiatic land ownership, right? The Albuquerque Morning Journal wrote that, while endorsing this, wrote that it was intended to, quote, "anticipate and prevent an Oriental invasion," end quote. So there's this anti-Asian sentiment of, again, attempting pretty successfully to keep any Asians from moving to New Mexico. So then the next year, 1922, is a congressional election year, and the parties continued to court women. Each, in fact, nominated 2 women to run for office. The Republicans nominate Nina Otero Warren to, in fact, run for Congress, which she becomes one of the first women to be nominated after the 19th Amendment passes. And she is the first woman of color to run for Congress. She started out on her campaign trail, and it was noted that, quote, "very few parts of the state have not received a visit from her. And considering the size of the state and the lack of travel infrastructure, one reporter noted, quote, "this is a most remarkable achievement." And she actually did make most of her trips by car. The Democrats nominated Soledad Chavez de Chacon for Secretary of State, and she's in the upper left corner there. She was friends with Dennis Chavez. She's actually his cousin. And again, she runs for this state office and she wins. Nina Otero Warren sadly did not win, but Soledad Chavez de Chacon won, and she became the first woman in the United States to serve in Secretary of State position. And she's also, again, the first Latina to serve in that position. So these 2 main parties really incorporate both Anglo and Hispanic women into their structures, but other women were left out, right? And I'm going to show, again, a picture of headlines that, I just want you to be aware of some of the language is historic. So I want to use the time I have left to think about those other women, and especially African-American and Native women. We saw that there are very few Asians in the state, and those property restrictions were going to keep the population low. But you can see all of these are after 1920, and they're all sort of thinking about women voters from different groups and thinking about them in very different ways. The Albuquerque Journal headline about Native people is actually out of Gallup. It's an ad out of Gallup. Another quick warning, there's a portrayal of an African-American woman on the next slide that's a little bit of a caricature. And in fact, that newspaper article on the left there was a somewhat negative one, but on the right, there's a newspaper out of Denver that was an African-American newspaper. And again, you can see a contrast in how Black women are portrayed. So Black women in New Mexico were also part of the club woman movement, but were generally not included in the New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs that were formed by Anglos and Hispanas. But they had a network throughout the West, and you see again that Denver newspaper talking about what's happening in Albuquerque. And they were also excited about the prospect of voting in the election of 1920. But an incident in Columbus, New Mexico shows that they were vulnerable even in a state that was not part of the Jim Crow South. So essentially, the election of 1920, women go to the polls in New Mexico. And in Columbus, New Mexico, there was a large contingent of African-American troops who were stationed at the border, who had in fact, were dealing with Pancho Villa's raids. And the women who were married to these soldiers attempted to vote. But soon after the election, there were allegations that, quote, election officials at Columbus, New Mexico, unlawfully refused to receive the votes of a number of Negro women, wives of the soldiers of the 24th Infantry stationed there, end quote. Newspapers said as many as 60 to 70 women were turned away, and this was enough votes to matter, particularly in the local sheriff's election, where it was assumed that their support for the Republican candidate would have given him the win. And so they went to court. And the question turned on whether or not they were residents of the state because their husbands were in the military. And a local newspaper, the Deming Headlight, explained, quote, the New Mexico Constitution provides that persons do not acquire or lose residency while in the service of the federal government. This clearly deprived the soldiers of the right to vote. And Judge Bratton held that their wives, under the provisions of the 19th Amendment to the federal Constitution, did not acquire a separate residence from their husbands, end quote. So in other words, even though women were enfranchised and could vote, the residency requirements that said if you were in federal service and living in the state of New Mexico, you had to actually be very explicit in declaring your residency, otherwise you weren't a resident. And that a woman's residency followed her husband's. So these women were ineligible to vote. As you recall, also, I mentioned Native stereotypes about Native women at the beginning, that they were seen as uncivilized, and that federal policy at this moment considered them legal wards and was really focused on the idea of assimilation or educating them into civilization, right? As many as a third of adult Indian people in the nation were legally wards. And honestly, the citizenship status of everybody else was really complicated and often misunderstood. The government was coordinating programs like land allotment and removing Native children from their families and sending them to boarding schools, including places like Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and Phoenix and Tucson. And citizenship and voting was often like the carrot that federal government would use to say, once you're civilized, you can vote. And in New Mexico, Native people were explicitly told that if they voted and participated in the US system of governance, they were giving up any right to tribal sovereignty, to tribal land, and tribal government, and forfeited those rights of federal protection. And I'm drawing here on Yavapai Apache scholar Maurice Crandall, whose book, These People Have Always Been a Republic, is really fantastic and talks a lot about New Mexico and Arizona and Native people up to 1912. So many Native people were rightfully wary of participating. And indeed, throughout the country, many Native people insisted that citizenship in their own nations was enough. But some Native suffragists suggested that Native people could be citizens of both the US and their own nations, and that they should be voting in federal and US elections. So Gertrude Bonin is one of those suffragists. She's a Yankton Dakota woman, and she continued to fight for citizenship and suffrage rights after 1920. She often appealed to the newly enfranchised women of the country, and indeed begins to work very closely with Californian Stella Atwood of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. Atwood and her group were really involved in New Mexico fighting against the Bursum Bill and against the Indian Dance Circular, which said Native people, it was illegal to do their dances. In 1924, in part due to their advocacy, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which endowed citizenship on all Native people, suggesting they could vote, right? Now, not all of them want it, and that's a different story, but Gertrude Bonin was really excited about the possibility of a Native voting bloc, particularly in certain Western states. And here's a pamphlet on the right that she produced, one of the organizations she founded. And you see on the pamphlet that she has laid out the population of Native people in all of the states. And she's emphasizing that in some states, they had enough that if they voted together, right, they could really change the politics of those states, right, and they could have some leverage. And so she sees this very optimistically. As you'll see on the next slide, white newspapermen and state legislators were also thinking about this, but they were a little more worried about it. They were not as optimistic. And again, that headline from Gallup in the upper right, you see the stereotypes about uncivilized Indians really remain strong. And indeed, despite this, in 1924, right after the Citizenship Act, both New Mexico and Arizona, the state courts ruled that Native people living on reservations, or Indians not taxed, could not vote in those states, right? So despite citizenship, they still couldn't vote. Other Western states passed a number of laws that were pretty similar to Jim Crow laws. So literacy tests, poll taxes. Some states like Montana moved registration sites really far away from reservations, and Montana actually dropped everybody from their voter rolls so that they'd have to re-register, knowing that Native people really couldn't get to registration offices. And this was the case. These tactics, right, disenfranchising tactics, were in place and kept Native people from voting until after World War II, and really until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in '65, and then some of its amendments in the 1970s, right? So very late into the 20th century. So to conclude, even in a state like New Mexico, where Spanish-speaking women had the opportunity to move into politics in ways that other women of color, including Mexican Americans in the neighboring states, particularly Texas, could not, other women continued to be disenfranchised, even in New Mexico, right, which seems pretty open. And what is important is that while the arguments for their disenfranchisement were not explicitly race-based, the intent and result was to target people of specific groups, right? So Native people, it's not that they're Native, it's that they live on reservation land, which the state knew was most Native people in New Mexico. The case of Black women in New Mexico, in Columbus, also demonstrates how the rights of all women were endangered because of those efforts to disenfranchise Black women, right? The ruling reinforced that a wife's political identity was tied to her husband's. And while that was, again, the justification for disenfranchising Black women, it could have been used against any other woman as well. So it's a reminder to us in the present that disenfranchisement hurts all of us in a democracy. So thank you very much. You can see here, I'll stop this in a second, but I'm happy to share it. These are just some, if you want further reading, here are some examples that I drew from. And as I mentioned, that Maurice Crandall book here is really interesting. So thank you. I'm curious if people have any thoughts about how New Mexico and Arizona sort of relate to each other. Here. Was it simply the number of Hispanos that made New Mexico so relatively open to voting? It didn't seem to be that way in Arizona. Yeah, absolutely, right? And one of the books I had listed, Rosina Lozano's An American Language, is a great background on this, that right after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, most of those territories, the former Mexican territories, the majority of people who were considered white citizens were Spanish speakers. And so initially in those territorial legislatures, they had a lot of power. And I think in every territory that comes out of that, the federal government was paying for the bilingual printing of laws and territorial legislature records, and was paying for interpreters in the sessions. But as the population demographics change in the different territories, right, starting with California and the gold rush, which just overwhelms the Spanish speakers there, the amount of political power, right, changes. And New Mexico is really the one territory where there was a large enough population that they maintained that power pretty far into the 20th century. And right, arguably there's still, right, New Mexico is where the first Democratic and Republican Latina governors were elected, the first Latino congressman, et cetera. So in Arizona, which the population numbers weren't big to begin with, and then get overwhelmed pretty quickly by Anglos. It changes a lot faster. It's a good question. And Mary asks, the Black women in Columbus were disenfranchised, but what about the other Black women? So that's a good question, Mary. I haven't found any other incidents of disenfranchisement of Black women. They're definitely not necessarily invited to a lot of the suffrage events that Anglo and Hispanic women are doing. And they're pretty small numbers. It's only a couple hundred, but I think that they are able to register to vote and do vote. The Columbus incident is actually not in my book. It's fairly new research, so I'm still interested in what's happening there. And there seems to be more to that story. It seems like New Mexicans were actually trying to get that the 24th Infantry is a famous group of Buffalo soldiers, right? And they had been in the Philippines, they had been in New Mexico, then they had been sent to Texas in 1917, where there was an incident where a couple of them were in town. They saw a white police officer sort of beat up a young Black boy. They kind of intervened, and there was a scuffle. A couple of them were arrested. And then later that evening, the entire unit marches on town, and there's another kind of, there's a fight, and several people, white and Black and bystanders, are killed. And so there's a court case. They're kind of brought back to New Mexico really quickly. This is in 1917. And so there's a lot of sort of racial tension around that. And so there seems to be an attempt around that time to get that unit kicked out of the state. So it is, I think, a little bit more complicated than the situation of other African Americans in the state. But I also think it's really telling. So did New Mexicans have large number of workers who, did New Mexico have large number of workers who came up from Mexico, and were the majority of Mexican American residents born in the US? Yes, that's a good question. And that's another thing that makes New Mexico pretty unique. So there's a couple things. First, the border between Mexico and New Mexico is actually pretty small because Texas kind of comes over, right? El Paso. So it's a smaller border, and had many fewer immigrants coming into the state from Mexico than Arizona or Texas. And so the Spanish speakers, the Nuevo Mexicanos in New Mexico, actually try to distance themselves a bit from Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And you'll notice, right, I'm calling them Hispanos a lot of the time. And they really emphasize that they are Spanish, of Spanish descent, right? They descend from the conquistadors. Part of Aurora Lucero's speech about the Spanish language is all about Spain, right? The literature traditions from Spain, right? Don Quixote and sort of some of this. So they're trying to really make claims to an identity that is European. And so, right, that's a very different kind of thing. And part of it is because they're watching Mexican Americans be discriminated against and Mexican immigrants, and they don't want to face that situation. So that's a great question. Shirley Mooney says she recently saw a documentary about that Black Army unit's attack on the town. Oh, interesting. I'll have to see if I can find that and look it up. Thank you. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of work to be done on sort of African-American history in New Mexico. I know there's a scholar working on, there was a town called Blackdom. It was a group of African-Americans from the South who moved kind of together and established a town in New Mexico, seeing it as a place that could be more of a haven. And so, right, race gets really complicated in a place like New Mexico. Mary Melcher wants to know if there's a suffrage marker for Nina Otero Warren. She and I both have worked together in a group called the National Votes for Women's Trail. And it was a great project that received funding to place markers in every state and territory, I think, in the Union. And, you know, so it was a lot of fun to sort of solicit people who should have, right, women who should be recognized. And Mary, you might want to, I don't know if you might want to say who in Arizona got recognized, but in New Mexico, the problem with Nina Otero Warren is it would have to be in Santa Fe, and the Santa Fe, so everyone was really excited to have one for her, but Santa Fe's zoning as a historical city doesn't allow for markers that are not created specifically for Santa Fe. And the National Votes for Women's Trail is purple and white, and they didn't like that. So they're trying to figure out what to do. I do think that she will have a marker in Santa Fe, but it's not necessarily the National Votes for Women's Trail marker. But I believe they put one in Las Vegas for Senator Jones, right, who is the man who helped get it out of the Senate, pass it through the Senate. And I think maybe Aurora Lucero, and then I know an Anglo woman named Sarah Reynolds, who was the chair initially, that steps down before Nina Otero Warren becomes chair. And her marker, I think, will be on the UNM campus. Mary Rothschild says that the African-American population at that time in Arizona was closely allied to African-Americans who'd been stationed at Fort Huachuca, I'm sorry if I'll mess that up, and became involved in cotton production. Did New Mexico find African-American soldiers chose to stay in the same way? Oh, that is a question that I don't know the answer to. As I said, this is a new part of my project, so I'll have to see. I know they close, you know, once the Pancho Villa raids and kind of the unrest on the border ends. So I think it's like 1924, they closed down the base there. And so that unit is transferred. And I know that the 24th Infantry goes on to, you know, later, I think they serve in Korea. So I don't know. That's a good question. I do know that African-Americans that I found working in the Indian service around the same time tended to leave and move to you know, places like St. Louis with larger African-American populations. But obviously not everybody did. But that's something I'll keep an eye out for. Thank you. Is it difficult for Native Americans to vote in New Mexico today? That's a good question. I haven't seen the same kind of concerns that, for example, you're currently seeing in Arizona, right? But right, for a long time, it was harder. And again, they don't change the laws until 1948. Both New Mexico and Arizona veterans returning from World War II sue for the right to vote and win. So I think it is not as contentious in New Mexico. And of course, right, Deb Haaland is the sort of example I would point to, the first of two Native women elected to Congress coming out of New Mexico. But I do know that there are sort of like get out the vote drives, and that generally, right, that disenfranchisement and those laws keeping Native people from voting did have kind of a long-term effort of suppressing Native voting participation. And there is, again, some hesitancy to vote because of this question of sovereignty, right? And so there are people in New Mexico who would say, I don't vote because I am not a US citizen, I'm a member of, right, the Laguna Pueblo or something like that. So there's not a uniform sort of position to voting among Native people. But I will say that I didn't see as much resistance to Native voting in New Mexico as I have in other Western states, right? The North Dakota law against, right, you had to have a street address, you couldn't use tribal ID, some of those kinds of laws, those haven't passed in New Mexico. But it's a good question and probably something to keep an eye on. All right. Well, thank you. Yes, this was really great fun. Those were excellent questions. And, I think it will help me as I go on with my research as well. Oh, sure. I'm always happy to talk about my book. So I do talk, I talk about it as a collective biography. I really focus on 6 women. Nina Otero Warren is one of them. And I sort of weave their stories together. So I'm also telling the story of women of color's participation in the suffrage movement. And then kind of like this talk, who was able to vote after 1920 and who wasn't. And I look at, again, Nina Otero Warren. I look at 3 Native women, Gertrude Bonin, or Zit Kalasa, whom I mentioned briefly, a woman named Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's Wisconsin Oneida, and Marie Bottineau Baldwin, who's Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And then an African-American activist and poet named Carrie Williams Clifford, who is the founder of the Ohio Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, which was where a lot of African-American women's suffrage activity happened. And then she moves to Washington and DC. She helps found the NAACP branch there. She's very involved. She's in that 1913 suffrage parade. And then the 6th woman I write about is a Chinese woman named Mabel Pinghua Lee from New York City. And she, because of US immigration law, is actually unable to become a US citizen because of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, but is very involved in suffrage in New York, and also is part of trans-Pacific conversations about the women's movement in China. So if you're interested, I hope you'll take a look. I tried to write it in a way that was, a compelling narrative, and you get to learn about these women, but then also how suffrage, right, how the fight for suffrage was very hard and didn't necessarily end in 1920. Oh, thank you, Mary. That's wonderful. I thank you. I'm glad to hear that. So, well, thank you all so much, and I hope I'll see you throughout the day in the other sessions. I'm looking forward to further conversations, and thank you again for inviting me and for being here with me this morning.
Thank you very much. We're really thrilled to have you here and have learned a lot from your presentation. When I'm looking at the schedule here, we were scheduled for a break between 10:15 and 10:25, and we are ahead of schedule. So I really encourage any of you that have questions while Kathleen is here that you ask, or comments that you would like to make about her presentation, what you learned, what was surprising. I always think it's interesting when you listen to someone who's done a lot of research, what were the questions they were asking when they were looking at their research? Did they find things that were surprising? Did that make them change their the way they were looking at it? So I'm going to ask you that question.
Those are always good questions. I always tell my students that curiosity is sort of the #1 skill that a historian has to have. And probably #2 is to follow your sources. And as you go along, if something surprises you, that's a great sign, right? If you're asking what's up with that, it means that it doesn't fit what you expect. And so you should follow that lead. So for me, I knew that the suffrage centennial was coming up. And I had actually encountered Marie Bottineau Baldwin, the Turtle Mountain Chippewa woman, in my first book. She worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In fact, all three of the women do, Native women. And but she also marched in that 1913 suffrage parade. And so I thought, oh, well, I could write an article about her. And we don't usually think about Native women as suffragists. And so during these anniversary celebrations, I want to make sure that her voice is there. And as I started researching the parade, I knew that African-American women were there because scholars of African-American history have written about them. But no one had really written much about Carrie Williams Clifford herself, and I found her very interesting. And then there was another Chinese woman who's in that parade. And I realized that maybe there were more stories about more women of color, and that I really wanted to make sure there was, that those were accessible again for the anniversary. So I just started writing, and the digitization of newspapers was a huge boon because the newspapers were kind of like the social media of the day. And there are a lot of little just mentions of this suffrage club had a meeting and this is who spoke, right? And maybe the title of their speech. So not a lot, but if you get enough of that, you can kind of put it together and see larger patterns. And so the most surprising story, so Nina Otero Warren living in New Mexico, right? New Mexicans know about her and they celebrate her, and she's in murals, and she has a biography, and her house in Santa Fe, the family house, is a museum. But outside of New Mexico, most people hadn't heard of her. So kind of thinking about, well, what are these other stories that need larger attention? But the Mabel Pink-Motley story of a Chinese woman who couldn't get citizenship, who was barred from citizenship in the United States. Why would she advocate for women's suffrage? Why would she put energy into that movement here? And then the story of what was happening in China, and that in China in 1911, right, that there's a women's suffrage movement and women are storming the Chinese parliament and demanding the right to vote. That really surprised me. And so that was a lot of fun to research. And I definitely, as I said, the women in Columbus, I came to that after I wrote the book, but I'm really curious and I'm trying to follow that up. And a couple of people have commented in here, this is really interesting. So yes, the question of Texas is very interesting, right? And the Hispanos were afraid of Texans' influence. I think there's more work to be done to think about that. And some historians have argued that Texans were behind some of Arizona's segregation laws. And so how was that, how are these ideas spreading from the South to the West is a really good question. Shirley Mooney says that it was fascinating that the Hispanic women in New Mexico allied themselves more with Spain than with Mexico. And did they look down on the Mexican Hispanics? So the women in New Mexico, I don't see them talking explicitly about Mexicans or Mexican Americans. They, though, definitely think of themselves, right? They think of themselves as upper class and kind of patrons, in the same way that Hispanic male politicians saw themselves often as patrons. And so they have kind of a sense that they need to help poor Spanish-speaking women. And that's part of the reason they get involved in politics. And this is right. I mean, Anglo women, elite Anglo women are also doing the same thing. So there's some class politics. But again, the Mexican and Mexican American population in New Mexico is pretty small. But it is these kind of elite, well-educated, bilingual women who are the ones who are involved in suffrage. And that's similar in California too. Some of the women who were from the California families, right, who had been in California, become citizens under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. There are Spanish-speaking women involved in California's fight for suffrage in 1911, doing similar kinds of bilingual work. And again, it's elite women. So I think I'd have to do more research, but I wouldn't be surprised if I found that. But I do think their strategy of calling themselves Spanish is about saying, and they do say this, right? we are also European, right? So you shouldn't treat us like you treat, you shouldn't be prejudiced against us because we're European and we have a tradition of great literature. And the other thing they use is less Mexicans and more Native people, right? And they talk about, well, the Spanish also conquered Native people, just like, the New Englanders. This is the moment the Daughters of the American Revolution is a huge, right, movement. There's a great deal of interest in kind of the colonial past in this early 20th century and the DAR. And so I think what they're trying to do is saying, just like the English were, conquering Native people in the Northeast, our Spanish ancestors were doing that in the Southwest. So we're just like you, right? So that's where I really see them using kind of these ideas of Spanishness. When of course, right, in New Mexico, that's true. There is a very long Spanish settlement there, but there's also a lot of intermarriage between natives and Spanish speakers in the state, and had been for years. So, they're all, and this is what I try to say in the book, is that all of these women are contending with, Anglo society that's really prejudiced, and particularly for Black women, really racist against them. And they're all trying to navigate that and using arguments to gain political power that sometimes rely on them saying, but we're not Native, right? Or we're not Black. And so that's part of what I was interested in, that, if we move beyond kind of how white women are making arguments, or even beyond Black and white women, because that's what we talk about a lot in US history. What about these sort of other groups that are not necessarily seen as white? How are they navigating these racial, and at the turn of the 20th century, it's a really, it's a rising white supremacy. You get the second Klan in the 1920s. Woodrow Wilson's administration is the first Southern administration since the Civil War. He segregates the civil service. So there's, Jim Crow is really expanding across the nation at this time. And so it's very fraught. Let's see. Natalie Rennell says, in light of the election of 2020 in Arizona and the large turnout of Native Americans, found your comments fascinating, thank you, about all of the efforts through the years to disenfranchise Native voting. Seems like what is old is new. Yes, I absolutely agree. It has been a little disheartening to do this work in this moment because, right, we like to think, 100 years later, like clearly there will have been progress and things will be so much better. And I see a lot of echoes. I think the newspaper headlines that I showed from the 1920s about the Native vote, right? This sense of how will this change politics? And it scared people. And I think we see that exactly with the mobilization of the Native vote in the last few elections, but particularly 2020, where, it seemed to really matter in some states and not always for the Democrats, right? In Arizona, it seems like it did, but in North Carolina, the Native population there, the Lumbee and Eastern Band Cherokee, particularly the Lumbee, swung really heavily for Donald Trump. So, one thing I like to point out is Native people are not a unified group. But I do think that that when people start to exercise political power and shake things up, you will see efforts to disenfranchise. And what has changed recently, of course, is the Supreme Court case in 2013, the Shelby v. Holder, that changed the Voting Rights Act, right? So the Voting Rights Act, couple of the really important things it did, not just for African Americans, but for Native people and Asians and Spanish speakers, was it has to do with a proportion of the population, but that states had to provide ballots and voting information in languages, right? When there were languages other than English that had a certain percentage of the population. And then also the pre-clearance clauses, right, which said that the Justice Department had to clear any law that dealt with voting, right, registration or access or anything around voting. Any state that had a history of disenfranchising groups of voters, the Justice Department got to oversee those laws before they could move forward. And we think of those states, right? It was all the former Confederacy, which makes sense when we're thinking about African Americans and Jim Crow. But it was also states like Arizona and South Dakota and Alaska. And those states, it was about disenfranchisement of Native people. And the Supreme Court said that, that those laws had been on the books for 50 years and that, that was very far in the past and was no longer an issue. And so they removed that pre-clearance section. And that's why we're seeing all of the laws that we are now, right? Because the federal government isn't overseeing that anymore. And again, like a lot of these laws are race neutral, that they're not necessarily saying Black people can't vote, but they are changing the election laws in targeted ways. And what we see, Carol Anderson has a book called, it's One Person, No Vote. But Carol Anderson, it's a great book that really shows how, I want to say ingenious, but I don't want to be positive, that these laws, people get very creative to try to disenfranchise certain groups. But what you see every time is that it hurts everyone. And in the American South during Jim Crow, voter participation rates were dismal for everyone. It suppressed everyone's votes to have those laws on the books. So, that's, I think we're at a moment where, we're going to see a lot of change, and we need to be aware of that. And I will say that Secretary of State is the most important position, or whichever official in the state government is in charge of voting. It's usually Secretary of State. Let's see. Is there a story behind the use of the women's full names? Yeah, that's a good question. That's Jean Luce. A lot of the women that I write about use, are hyphenating or using both their maiden name, for lack of a better word, and their married names. I think for the Spanish-speaking women in particular, they were often marrying Anglo men. Warren does, a number of other women do. And I think they're very proud of their Spanish heritage, so they continue to use that. But we see a lot of suffragists do this as well. So it's part of the kind of feminist politics that they have. So I think that's a good catch, good eye. And all right, Shirley Mooney has put a post in about local politics that I'm gonna I don't know if everybody can see this, but I don't know about this. I just don't know about Arizona politics as well as you guys. So more details at the website. So yeah, it's the resonances, as someone said, right? You really see these echoes and realize that these are long, ongoing struggles in American history, but also in our American present. This is something we've been, this question of access to democracy and who's going to vote has been something that's really been a struggle for a long time. And women have been involved in that struggle, right, for a very long time and continue to be, right? We see across the different states, women often leading these efforts to expand the right to vote and sometimes to constrict the right to vote, right? I mentioned very briefly that there were women who were anti-suffragists, and there were. And you see sort of that legacy, I think, as well. Yes. Shirley Mooney writes that suffragists also used their full, the married and maiden name to show they were respectably married. Yeah, and actually, right, I mean, they weren't all respectably married. Nina Otero Warren is divorced. Marie Bottineau Baldwin, again, Bottineau is her, right, the native family, and Baldwin was her Anglo husband, divorced. And both of them actually let people think they were widows because that was a lot more respectable. So yeah, right. And being in public, speaking in public, was still, right, questionable. It was becoming more respectable, but being involved in the suffrage movement could lead you to be castigated. So you're right, respectability is really important. And then this is, I think, a good place to kind of end. Mary Rothschild says the state legislature, is that, I think Arizona is what you're saying, had 43 bills on voting, most of which make it harder to vote, and many of them have passed. Yeah, so there's a lot of legislative activity that we need to be aware of. So that was great. Thank you all. Those were really, again, wonderful questions and comments, and I'm really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I think it's important to know that Arizona women and women in many other states, of course, did not just sit on their laurels after they got the vote, but they were involved in very many things. We have two speakers on this panel this morning. Our first speaker is Heidi Osselier. Heidi earned both her master's degree and doctorate in U.S. history at Arizona State University. She's taught at Arizona State University, Scottsdale Community College, and Phoenix College, and is the author of Winning Their Place, Arizona Women in Politics, 1883 to 1950, published by the University of Arizona Press in 2009, and Arizona's Deadliest Gunfight, Draft Resistance and Tragedy at the Power Cabin, 1918, published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2018. She served as historical consultant for two documentary films, Power's War, released in 2015, and Women on the Mother Road, The Women of Route 66. She's been active with the Arizona Women's Heritage Trail and written extensively on women in Arizona history. She was the recipient of the 2011 Charlotte Hall Award for her valuable contributions to the understanding and awareness of Arizona and its history. Heidi?
And Melanie, thank you for having me today and inviting me to join this group. I feel like this is an area that was investigated by many different people over the years, the legislative agenda of women. But in doing some recent research, I feel strongly that it's also an area that still really we could go back and do a lot more. And I'll give you some hints along the way where we could do some better research. Women's, when they gained the right to vote in Arizona in 1912, did not, as Melanie said, sit back and just rest on their laurels. They did get actively involved in campaigns, legislative campaigns, to change the laws of the state. By and large, their agenda was what was considered then a woman's agenda. They were actively pursuing the notion that women should be guardians of the home, the family, morality. And to that effect, their agenda included issues like education, especially tax appropriations to improve schools, and to require compulsory education. That was already a stipulation of the state constitution, but they sought to improve compulsory education laws. They also tried to improve public health, which was part of a national effort, pure food and drug laws, sanitary stock laws, stockyards, production plants, access to clean water were top priorities. Children were always high on the list as well. They sought to create county welfare boards to take care of children who were from poor families, but also to build different types of schooling, reform schools, schools for children with mental disabilities to help them, because otherwise they were falling through the cracks. Morality was also on the women's legislative agenda, most notably when women voted for the first time in 1914, what many believe was their most important legislative accomplishment was the prohibition law in Arizona that passed that year, largely with the support of newly enfranchised women. It had been kicking around in different formats for many years with local option laws, but this was the first state very strict prohibition law in Arizona, and women rallied to support it. Also, at the local level in the 1910s, they supported gaming legislation against gambling, and to raise the age of consent for women. That's an important law because when you establish the age of consent, you establish at what point a girl becomes a woman, and statutory rape and prostitution laws all revolved around that. So that was very much part of their agenda. They also saw at the local levels to make sure that matrons were hired at the state prison, that policewomen were engaged by major cities to monitor behavior of young people, and public entertainment, which was becoming much more of an issue with movie houses and other areas that young people could go, and they felt that women should be out there monitoring for any kind of immoral behavior. Finally, working conditions were on their list of priority: wages for women, minimum wage laws, and widows' tax exemption. We'll talk more about some of these issues as we go on. But Nellie Bush, who was a Democrat from Yuma, said that women must live and raise families under the laws of the state. Therefore, they must protect that sphere in which they move. That is a woman's reason for being in politics. So as women ran for office to expand their traditional roles as mother and housekeeper, the early legislative gains were often solo acts of the very few women who were elected to the state legislature. They tended to cluster on the committees that were geared towards what we considered traditional women's work, overseeing education, welfare, public health committees, and also good roads committees. Because women did like to get out and drive. I'm doing a bit on a woman sports reporter who at the Arizona Republican and this era, and it's amazing how much work women did to improve roads because they really wanted to get out and drive. It offered them so much freedom. Women's clubs often pressured local officials at this time to create different censorship boards and commissions to look into morality. And I think this is one of the areas that we could go back and revisit in some of the bigger cities of the states, certainly Phoenix and Tucson, Bisbee as well. Women's groups really pressured, so with mixed results, local officials to create commissions to regulate morality, to hire police matrons and whatnot. I think one of the major issues you see is censorship. And we have to remember in the 1910s, we have silent films becoming quite the fad. And they were completely uncensored until 1915 and beyond. And there was a lot of erotic material in it. Theda Bara's movies came out. She played the vamp, which was this very eroticized character. And so women's groups really rallied to try to engage local officials into getting censorship boards. And what's surprising is after they pressured men to start these local boards to analyze what films are being shown and to bar some of them, then local male officials said to the women, you can't be on that board. It's just too tawdry, too inappropriate for women. So there was this tremendous friction at the local levels. And I'd love to see some more research done, because I think that's where a lot of work got done in these early years. The best results, the most noticeable results, the ones that the newspapers picked up on and historians therefore have picked up on, were when women were elected to the legislature and when women's groups got behind their efforts and lobbied for passage of the bills. Frances Willard Munns, a Democrat from Yavapai, was of course the head of the women's suffrage movement when it came to fruition in 1912, and then ran for the state Senate in 1914. She introduced numerous bills during her one term in the Senate, but she considered her two most important successes were her effort to raise the age of consent from 14 to 16 for women and to 18 for men. So that means they could not engage in sex or get married until those ages. And on top of it, her law made it a felony for any public school official to violate any morals law. So increasing the penalties if a school official obviously had sex or somehow violated any moral laws with regarding to vice. And so I think her bill was trying to put some teeth into previous laws that were passed. Her bill was unsuccessful that year, but was reintroduced a couple of years later by a co-suffrage worker, Pauline O'Neill. And because that received the backing from the Arizona Federation of Women's Clubs, it was finally signed into law into law in 1919, which tells us that you really need that both groups working. You need a women's club backing the bills introduced by individual females in the state legislature. You needed them to tag team to get anything done successfully. The second bill that Frances Munns thought was her most important bill was the one that raised a widow's tax exemption. The first state legislature here had passed the first old age pension in the country and widowed mother's law as well. So if you were a widow and you had young children, you could receive a pension. And so that was quite a benefit for women in this state. But what Frances Willard Munns's law did was raise the exemption for widows. In those days, we weren't taxed on personal income so much as we were taxed on personal property. So if you owned a piano or a chandelier, different luxury items, you were taxed on those. And so the exemption was raised from $1,000 for a widow to $2,000. And for business owners, women who ran a hotel, a restaurant, things like that, that was really an important thing, because a lot of what they were taxed on were the items that they had in their stores or restaurants. Again, this was not passed outright by the legislature. It was referred to the voters as a referendum. And again, women's groups advocated for it at the ballot box, and that's how it was passed into law. So we see that being the winning combination for a lot of female legislation. Another early member of the state legislature was Rosa McKay, who was a Democrat from, first she represented Cochise County, and later on after the Bisbee deportation, when she ran out of town for her very vocal opposition to the deportation, she was elected from Gila County. Rosa McKay has been described as by the newspapers as an aggressive female legislator, and I think that would be probably a very apt description of her combative style. She, while professing to be a member of the Democratic Party, had strong socialist leanings and almost single-handedly passed a minimum wage law for women in 1917. A previous progressive legislature had already passed an 8-hour workday bill for men and women, but now she sought a minimum wage act that would provide $12 a week to protect women who are working out in the business world. This bill was geared for women who were working in department stores, as waitresses at Harvey houses, laundry workers, shop girls, clerical workers. And at the time, they were being paid between $3 and $6 an hour. So this is quite a significant wage rate raise. I think the final bill settled on $10 a week. Did I say an hour? I'm sorry, $3 to $6 a week. It's easy to mix that up in today's world when the numbers are more for per hour than per week. But women were often paid less than men at that time for equal work based on this assumption that they didn't have a family to support. But of course, that was not always the case, especially in Arizona, which was a health seeker state where the main industry was mining. Many men were compromised by lung ailments or disabled in industrial accidents, so wives and daughters were often the breadwinners. The minimum wage bill that was introduced by Rosa McKay was strongly opposed by the Republican Party, by the mining companies and the railroad companies, because they believed, even though they did not generally hire women, they worried it would lead to a law that would require a minimum wage for men. Most legislative leaders declared the bill dead on arrival, and McKay's thrilling bursts of oratory one day, and the bill was passed. She's told the legislature and the media the rights of the female laborer were better safeguarded in women voting states than non-suffrage states. Several bills were passed over the years which increased the minimum wage for women. By 1923, it became $16 a week, but it was invalidated by a United States Supreme Court decision in 1925 because it did give an unequal advantage to women. Also, women's groups felt it created an uneven playing field and opposed it. And that would be the Arizona Business and Professional Women's Club, which we will talk about in a minute because they had a much more modern sense of equality than a lot of traditional women's groups who felt it was a minimum wage for women was the way to go at that time. I would say, from my experience, sometimes women's legislation, women were their own worst enemy when it was coming to passing legislation for women. And the largest women's club in the state, the Arizona Federation of Women's Club, was adamantly opposed to lobbying the legislature. And this was a great impediment to passing more legislation than they did. The Federation president in 1919, Emma Gill, told members she believed women having the vote was sufficient, that politics should not mix with club life, that, quote, we should rather stress the literature and art departments and other so-called more womanly activities of the clubs, end quote. She felt, and her fellow members felt, it was enough to have a woman representative in the legislature. But realistically speaking, can one person, even a strong female politician, move mountains alone? It just wasn't realistic. The legislature required getting together and voting in blocks. It required tremendous amount of lobbying, and the Arizona Federation of Women's Clubs just wouldn't get behind it. They believed the bill should be, quote, allowed to stand or fall on their own merits, unquote. So in that respect, a lot of middle-class white women who belonged to these clubs demonstrated a naive understanding of politics and really dismissed the notion that passing bills required enormous cooperative efforts. Their unwillingness to go to bat often signaled to men that women were just not serious about politics. The Arizona Federation of Women's Clubs spent much of their time raising funds to build libraries, providing public restrooms, and meeting to discuss books. But a handful of their civic organizations, and again, coming back to this notion that at the local level, at the civic level, a lot was getting done. Women like Pauline O'Neill, who formed the Phoenix Civic League, were quite politically active, making sure that local food production plants were sanitary, demanding seats on different commissions, and demanding change with regard to rights of women and children. So I think that is, again, where a lot of the local women's clubs had the most clout, not at the legislative level, but at the municipal level. However, there were a handful of bills that the State Federation of Women's Clubs did support at their state meetings, even if they would not lobby for them. And that included the formation and passage of a law that allowed for state kindergartens. They passed an improved compulsory school attendance law in support of the federal Shepherd-Tanner Act, which provided health care for newborns. They recognized in laws that illegitimate children could be the legitimate heirs of their natural parents. And they formed a children's colony for children with mental disabilities. Previous to this, and this is a bill introduced by Nellie Bush in the legislature and passed over Governor Hunt's veto in 1927. Prior to this bill, the creation of the children's colony, children that had learning disabilities, that had any kind of mental disabilities, were sent to state asylums or to the state industrial school, which was specifically designed for juvenile delinquents. So this bill, the Children's Colony Bill, was passed with backing from the state organization of parent-teacher organizations. So this was, again, an effort of a woman and women in the legislature, supplemented by backing of women's organization. In 1920, C. Louise Boringer, a Democrat from Yuma, took over as the legislative chair for the Arizona Federation of Women's Club. And she worked with Vernetti Ivy, Maricopa County's representative in the House, to introduce a child welfare law. The bill created county boards to distribute welfare to low-income families with young children. But unfortunately, the legislation did not provide for funding to hire people to serve on these boards. So women's clubs, especially the Arizona Federation of Women's Clubs, their members stepped in to do the unpaid work of determining who was eligible for welfare payments. Again, this is an area I think we should maybe look into a little bit more. Maybe some work has done, but I think because most of the women who sat on these boards were middle class white women, I'm not sure that much of the funding went to children from non-white families. One group, again, that needs a lot more research and doing a peripheral subject on this now and collecting a big stack of material is on the Arizona Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. It's been touched upon by many people in doing women's history of African-American women in Arizona. But I think it's time to pull this together in a more comprehensive way. Of course, in 1915, the General Federation of Women's Clubs banned admission of women of color. And Arizona is a very small female Black community, which numbered less than 1,000 in the 1910 census. Oh, I'm losing I need a glass of water. Hold on a second. The female Black community in Arizona numbered less than 1,000 in the 1910 census. They formed the Arizona Federation of Colored Women's Clubs under the leadership of Ella S. White, and dedicated themselves to fighting racism and improving economic and educational opportunities for their people. But they had so many strikes against them as far as organizational abilities that they really could not command a legislative agenda. It was not until 1918 that the first Black newspaper was established in the state. And often white-owned newspapers failed to cover their events and their organizations. The one exception, of course, was the Arizona Republican newspaper, and the society columnist there, Sarah Jacobs, a Jewish woman who was quite a feminist. She had been the press agent for the suffrage movement and worked for Francis Willard Munns. She actually was the only one in the state that gave the Arizona Federation of Colored Women's a voice in her society columns, allowing them to print their views from a Black perspective. Because there were no African-American members of the legislature until the 1940s, they again had little legislative clout, working mostly at the municipal level. In the 1920s, to oppose the resurgence of the appearance of the Ku Klux Klan in Phoenix, women like Ella White and others worked with the Phoenix City Council to halt the playing of the racist silent film Birth of a Nation, and they were behind the efforts to pass a federal anti-lynch law. Again, there has been some great work. Mary Melcher, I know you've done some work. Matthew Whitaker, others have done work on this organization, but I think we're at a point where we need to come back and start pulling much more of this information together, because I see from newspaper articles and others that their work at the municipal level was really quite significant. We get to this juncture at the end of the 1910s where women's clubs, existing women's clubs, have only so much sway over legislature in Arizona. Some of the women, like C. Louise Boehringer of the Arizona Federation of Women's Clubs, really were discouraged with the activities and wanted to see a much more robust women's agenda put through the legislature. And at that point in 1920, she was instrumental in establishing the Arizona Business and Professional Women's Clubs, which did seek to sustain battles to significantly expand the rights of women in Arizona. The idea of a national business and professional women's clubs got its start during World War I, when women joined the workforce temporarily, often because of the war effort, and in large numbers did not receive equal pay for equal work. They are often barred from professional organizations like the local state bar, American Medical Association, and others. While most women joined women's clubs for friendship, BPW women worked to eliminate the segregation of the sexes in the public sphere. To that end, they supported female candidates for office in Arizona. And we're going to have Jan Lavecchio come on and talk about the ERA, but I think she will tell you that even this aspect of the Arizona BPW was unique. Their support for female candidates in Arizona did not apply nationwide. So they were on the front lines as well when they were hiring them. Let me start over. When they were putting women in office by supporting their candidacies, raising funds for them, giving them moral support, and going out and, asking people to vote for them, the BPW were really putting themselves in the front line to pass laws to level the playing field. 14 of the 35 women who served in Arizona's legislature from 1914 to 1950, almost half, were members of the Business and Professional Women's Club. It's a staggering number because this was a small organization with not a large membership. Really amazing accomplishments. The BPW's agenda was very extensive. I'll just give you some of the highlights. Jury duty was always on the top of their list. They believed that a woman should have a trial by her peers. It did not pass until after the conclusion of World War II, because the argument by most people, men and women alike, was that women were unsuited to be jurors. They belonged at home. It was improper to be sequestered with men or to hear graphic stories of rape and murder. Women were too emotional, too sentimental to pass judgment on a criminal. But of course, the problem was women, especially in Arizona, tended to own businesses, property. They worked outside the home. Of course, they could also be charged with crimes, or they could be sued. And of course, they were often the victims of crimes, murder, rape. So to not have a jury of their peers was decidedly a stroke against them. BPW women also fought against the minimum wage that had been championed by Rosa McKay, showing a definite split in women's legislative attainments. Women in the movement for the BPW movement believed that if you're going to have a minimum wage law, it should apply to everyone equally. They knew that women would not be hired to a job if they had to be paid more than a man. And that was the standing of the BPW leadership. Rank and file members of that club and other women, especially with the Arizona Federation Women's Club, believed that the playing field was already so unequal that only by giving women a minimum wage could they even hope to catch up to what men were making. So this was a highly contested notion in the 1910s and 20s, not only in the broader legislative agenda, but also within women's groups themselves. They just didn't agree on how that should play out. The BPW fought against the federal act, the 1932 Economy Act passed by Congress, that said that married couples could not, members of a married couple could not both be federal employees. Again, because women usually were paid less than men, that meant that more women than men lost their jobs because of the 1932 Economy Act. BPW also helped defeat the 1907 Expatriation Act, which said if a woman married a foreign man, she lost her US citizenship. They worked very hard to pass the 1922 Cable Act. When that happened, women who had married men who were not US citizens actually had to be repatriated and reapply for citizenship. They also worked for access to birth control information. A very young member of the legislature, 26-year-old Fritzie Struckmeyer, was elected to the House in 1937. And she introduced the first bill in the United States to amend a state penal code to eliminate the ban on the dissemination of birth control information. Eventually, what passed was a watered down version of her bill that would have wiped out all penalties for disseminating birth control information. The watered down bill said that only doctors could distribute the information, but it was considered a very important first step in women gaining access to birth control information. This happened in the 1930s, of course, when there was the Great Depression and there was universal interest in, birth control, because having large families when the breadwinner is unemployed was always considered a difficult thing. Finally, I'm going to turn it over to Jan because the law that the BPW wanted that would erase all the laws on the books that tilted the scales towards men was, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment introduced in 1923 by Alice Paul. The leaders of the BPW knew that as long as there were thousands of laws on the books discriminating against women, it was going to be like, as one leader said, bailing an ocean with a sieve. And they believed the ERA was the only way that we could readily take care of the problem, the legislation that was slanted against women. Okay, let Jan take over.
Thank you very much. I'll just give a brief introduction for Jan. And those of you who have questions, please put them in chat. And when we get to the end of this session, or after Jan's finished, we will start answering those. Jan Lavecchio is an award-winning writer who researches and speaks on Arizona women's history. She served on the coordinating council for the Arizona Women's Heritage Trail and is a former Arizona Humanities Council speaker. She is also a past president of Arizona Business and Professional Women. As a board member of the Arizona Business and Professional Women's Foundation, she researched and wrote volume 3 of Women Who Made a Difference, a 3-volume series of biographies of Arizona women published by the BPW/Arizona Foundation. Her research interests include social and economic issues that affected women in the early 20th century, such as the fight for women to serve on juries and the Arizona minimum wage law for women. So, Jan?
Well, thank you for asking me to speak today. I want to make a few brief comments before I start my presentation. First, in preparing this talk, I found that it was impossible to separate the Arizona Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs ERA lobbying from the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs ERA lobbying, because you're talking about the same organization. It's the national with the state federations, and they're all working for the same goal. So my talk is going to focus on both. I have expanded the time frame of my talk to cover the 1950s because I want to briefly discuss the Carl Hayden rider to the Equal Rights Amendment. And I think it's also important to note that the Equal Rights Movement for the Equal Rights Amendment has lasted longer than the suffrage movement. My sources for this talk that I'm doing today are volumes 1 through 3 of the BPW USA history books, the BPW USA national magazines, volumes 1 through 3 of the BPW Arizona history books, the BPW Arizona State Magazine, State Legislative Reports, Club Reports, State Board Meeting, and Convention Minutes. All of these items are in the BPW Arizona collection at the State Archives. Some equal rights issues published by the National Women's Party magazine, the National Association of Women Lawyers website, the 1938 Congressional Record, which is available digitally, and a wonderful book by Judith Patterson, Be Somebody, a biography of Marguerite Raywalt, which I highly recommend. It's an invaluable source of firsthand account of the ERA ratification process. So to begin, I want to begin briefly by describing the organizations and the players, and then we'll talk about the lobbying efforts from roughly 1937 to 1959. I'm not going to discuss every year. I'm just going to hit key years. In 1899, the Women's Lawyer Club was founded in New York City by 18 women lawyers who were not permitted to join a male organization for lawyers. This organization was reorganized in 1923 as the National Association of Women Lawyers and is still in existence today. In 1916, the National Women's Party was organized. And in 1919, BPW USA was organized. Now, since Heidi has talked briefly about how that came to be, I'm going to throw in a little bit more information about what actually happened. During World War I, the War Work Council contacted the YWCA to organize business women workers who worked for the war effort. And they allocated $65,000 for this project. A National Business Women's Committee was formed. The leader of this was Lena Madsen Phillips. But the war ended before they really got anything going to organize women workers nationally. So it was Lena Madsen Phillips who had conceived the idea to use this money to fund a national organization for working women. And she called these women to meet in St. Louis in 1919. This meeting was attended by 400 women from throughout the United States. And this was the beginning of BPW, the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs, which I will refer to as BPW USA. There were, by the end of 1919, the membership was 25 state federations throughout the United States. And a year later, the membership of BPW USA was 26,000 women with 217 clubs throughout the United States. The Arizona Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs was founded by C. Louise Behringer, but it was 1921. Now, I think it's noteworthy that to comment that at the organizational meeting in St. Louis, some of these women who came, there were many women from many professions who came, but a significant number of women who came were members of the National Association of Women Lawyers Club. And these women lawyers wrote the national bylaws for BPW USA and became joint lawyers. Even more significantly to me is the fact that 5 of the early presidents from roughly 1919 to 1950 were lawyers. And so this means that even when these women were not actually presidents, they were on the national board as vice presidents. Who were these women? Well, the very first president was Gail Laughlin. She was the joint member of both groups, a woman lawyer from California that wrote the Women's Jury Bill in California. And then she was from 1919 to 1920. Lena Madsen Phillips, the founder, was a woman's lawyer, and she was president from 26 to 29. Then we come to Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who is very significant because she's the 3rd woman in the United States to be appointed a federal judge. And we all know her as the woman on the plane that swore LBJ into office after Kennedy's assassination. She was a vehement worker for women's rights. And then she was president from 50 to 52. Then there's Marguerite Raywalt, who's the national president from 54 to 56, and also the national president of the National Association of Women Lawyers, and the first woman president of the Federal Bar Association, but not all at the same time. In later years, she was the legal counsel for the National Organization for Women and was appointed by Kennedy for the Commission on Status of Women. Hazel Palmer was the last woman lawyer who was a national president, and she was president from 56 to 58. In Arizona, the members who were members of both groups, some of these women lawyers were Lorna Lockwood, Alice Birdsall, Mary Wupperman, Gertrude Converse, and Virginia Hash. Now, the women who were key players for the ERA lobbying effort in Arizona was Harriet Jean Oliver, who was the journal clerk for the territorial legislature when we became a state and worked at the state capitol for 38 years. She was a Phoenix BPW club member, state president, and long-term legislative chair for the Federation. Estelle Bjerg is especially noteworthy. She's a Flagstaff Superior Court reporter, and she was the one that led the opposition of BPW to the minimum wage law in 1938. And she was state president from 36 to 38. Her husband was Danish, and he was a faculty member at Northern Arizona University. She had a special axe to grind for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment because she was a victim of the Expatriation Act that Heidi mentioned and had lost her citizenship and only regained it when she became a naturalized citizen. Lorna Lockwood, we're all familiar with. She was the first woman to serve on the Chief Justice of a state Supreme Court and the first woman on the Arizona Supreme Court, as well as a state legislator. But more importantly for this talk, she's a Phoenix BPW president and a state president from 56 to 57. Gertrude Converse is a woman lawyer who was the BPW state ERA chair and Phoenix BPW president from 48 to 51. She was the first woman to run for Maricopa County Superior Court judge. And finally, there's Pauline Bates Brown, who is the first woman editor, Sunday editor of the Arizona Republic. So again, I want to stress that during the time period I'm talking about, this effort was a long effort. It involved all the national members, all the state members, all the presidents, but I'm only highlighting a few. 98 years ago, in 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in Congress by Senator Charles Curtis and Representative Daniel Anthony, who was a nephew of Susan B. Anthony. Like the suffrage movement and the movement, the fight for women to serve on juries, the Equal Rights Amendment was controversial. It was supported by both men and women and opposed by both men and women. And from the very beginning, there were women who opposed this strongly, starting with the opposition of the League of Women Voters in 1923 and Mary Anderson, who was director of the Women's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor. From 1924 to 1938, their bill was introduced every single congressional session, but very little action occurred. And then things began to change in the mid-30s. In 1935, the National Association of Women Lawyers Clubs endorsed the ERA amendment as part of their legislative platform, followed by the endorsement of BPW USA in 1937, making them two of the first women's groups outside the National Women's Party to endorse this amendment for ratification, for passage. At that time, in 1935, BPW USA had 65,000 members. At the 1935 National Convention in St. Louis, in Atlantic City, this bill, having BPW endorsed, conclude this ERA amendment as part of their legislative platform, was unanimously voted for approval by the convention body. And immediately afterwards, the women were so excited about that and about the fact that they had just received news that Section 213 of the National Economy Act had been repealed. They adjourned for a victory parade on the boardwalk of Atlantic City, where they carried their state banners. During the discussion at the convention meeting before the motion was approved, various state presidents spoke in favor of this motion, including Arizona President Estelle Bjerg, who said, quote, "Arizona women have just had protective legislation thrust upon them. We cried everywhere for help and there was none." She's referring to the minimum wage law of that year. "Unless there is an ERA amendment in the Constitution of the United States, you and other states will find yourselves crying for help and there will be none. Arizona appeals to you to function for the purpose for which we as business women banded together. We need the ERA amendment," end quote. But as I said, that even at that time, this bill was still opposed by most of the women's organizations, which included the League of Women Voters, the American Association of University Women, and the National Council of Catholic Women. The first significant event that I want to talk about occurred in Congress in 1938. In that year, BPW Arizona leaders organized a campaign targeting Arizona Senator Henry Ashurst, who was also the Judiciary Committee chair in Congress, to get him to change his opposition to the ERA and support it. After he was flooded with 3,600 telegrams, he did change his position, and he scheduled the Equal Rights Amendment to be heard by the Judicial Committee that he chaired. The hearing was from February 7th to the 10th in 1938, and the committee voted 9-9. The resolution was reported to the Senate without recommendation, so it died. And it was the first time the Equal Rights Amendment was ever reported to a branch of Congress. In the congressional record for that hearing, there is a telegram from Pauline Bates Brown that she sent in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. And there's also a telegram from BPW State President Estelle Bjerg, who said, quote, "The Arizona Federation of BPW, composed of working women holding jobs from littlest to biggest, urge favorable vote of the ERA so they may be accorded full citizenship. Amendment may not be approved by all women's organizations, but how many measures have you passed carrying approval of all men's organizations? We do not think small groups of men or women should deprive the vast majority of women from having equal privileges and protections of the Constitution." I found it very interesting that two women who sent letters of opposition in the congressional record at that hearing included Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins. Now, the other women's organizations that opposed BPW and these two women, they opposed it because they believed that if the ERA amendment was passed, it would remove the protective laws that had been established to protect women's working conditions and safety and minimum work schedules in factories. They were pro-union, and they felt it would adversely affect this situation. So that was the reason for opposing it. At the 1938 BPW Arizona State Convention, resolutions were passed to thank Senator Burke of Nebraska for introducing the ERA amendment in the Senate, and a resolution to thank Senator Ashurst for supporting the ERA. At this time, the BPW Arizona membership was 641 members. Also, in that year, Estelle Bjerg chaired a meeting of a group of women from representatives from different organizations, and a Women's Joint Legislative Committee of Arizona was formed and led by Estelle Bjerg and sponsored by BPW Arizona, which worked on the Equal Rights Amendment. In her 1939 legislative report, Harriet Oliver recommended, quote, "that we continue to keep foremost on our agenda the removal of restrictions and continue to work for the Equal Rights Amendment for women in Arizona, that we demand equal opportunity for women in industry, business, and the professions, and that we oppose any legislation of the sex protective laws," end quote. The next significant act was in 1946. By this time, slowly, momentum is building for the Equal Rights Amendment. In that year, BPW USA published a booklet entitled "The Equal Rights Amendment and Why We Support It," and distributed copies of this booklet to all members of Congress, the press and broadcasting services, and all BPW USA members, who numbered 101,722 women by that point in time. In that year, the ERA bill was voted for the first time in the US Senate. This co-sponsor of the bill was Senator Ernest McFarland from Arizona, who would later become an Arizona governor and serve on the Arizona Supreme Court. And it should be noted in passing that it's just a coincidence that Ernest McFarland's wife is an Arizona BPW member. She was a member of Florence BPW. But the vote was scheduled without advance notice for a vote on the Senate calendar when 18 senators who supported ERA were absent, including Ernest McFarland, who was in Arizona at that time. So it passed the Senate by 38 to 35, which was not a 2/3 majority, so it failed. And it should also be noted that Governor Sidney Osborne supported the ERA amendment, but Senator Carl Hayden voted against the Equal Rights Amendment, even though he had previously promised BPW Arizona members that he would vote for it. BPW Arizona members wrote letters of protest to Senator Carl Hayden, and one letter that was written by a League BPW club member. League BPW was a Phoenix club member, not Phoenix BPW, another club in Phoenix. Her letter was to Carl Hayden, was printed in the state magazine. I will not read the entire letter, but I want to just briefly read a few of the closing of it. After the introductory paragraphs, she ended her letter by saying, quote, "Second, and this is doubly important, Arizona women, you sent word to the Democratic Committee at the time Fickett of Tucson ran against you that you would support by your vote any measure on equal rights which the Senate Judiciary Committee reported favorably. In addition, you assured several Phoenix women personally that you would support the Equal Rights Amendment. You did not support it. This seems a reversal of Hayden form. Ordinarily, Arizona can depend upon your promises. Since the women involved are of unimpeachable integrity and our officers have checked individually with several of them to be doubly certain there was no misunderstanding of your promise, we have no alternative but to believe that you must have considered your promise very lightly and that it must have been given for the purpose of inquiring your capture of the women's vote only." And the article about this letter in the state magazine ends with the editor's statement, quote, "We are asking each club to write a letter to Senator Hayden concerning this matter now to show Senator Hayden we are alert to his action and that we do want the Equal Rights Amendment bill passed." Our state federation has written a strong letter also. And in 1946, the state membership was 1,500 women. Carl Hayden did reply to this letter, and his response was printed in the next issue of the state magazine. And this I am going to read in its entirety. It's a bit long, but I think it's important to read. Quote, "This is in reply to your very proper inquiry as to why I did not vote for the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. I finally decided to vote no after talking to senators who said they were going to vote for it against their better judgment just because they promised to do so. Several of them said that if theirs were the deciding votes, they would oppose this resolution to submit the amendment as reported to the Senate, but that it was entirely safe to vote aye because they knew that it would not obtain the required 2/3 majority. I am fairly well acquainted with the way that Congress acts and am sure that I am correct in predicting that the only kind of an equal rights amendment that can win a 2/3 majority in both branches is one that affirmatively recognizes the authority of the state and the federal government to enact legislation for the benefit of women as distinguished from men. It will have to be worded in accordance with the idea expressed in the following text. There shall be no economic, legal, political, or social discrimination because of sex or marital status in the United States of America or territory subject to its jurisdiction. Nothing in this article shall be construed as to invalidate or prevent enactment of legislation benefiting women in their work or family status. No group of American citizens can have it all their own way. And the result is that all important legislation is the result of compromise. The Constitution was made by compromising divergent opinions, and compromises were necessary to bring about the existing amendments to it. A practical way to accomplish the desired result would be for the leaders of the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs and other like organizations which have favored the Equal Rights Amendment to arrange for a national conference with the representatives of the National League of Women Voters, the American Association of University Women, the National Council of Catholic Women, the National Women's Trade Union League, and other similar women's organizations which are opposed to this amendment in its present form. In 1949, BPW State President Felice Crowder, who I'll mention in passing was our first Hispanic state president, appointed a BP Arizona committee in addition to the state's legislative committee, and appointed Gertrude Converse to chair this committee. And Gertrude then assumed the role of coordinating the effort of sending telegrams and letters from BPW Arizona members to state legislators and their national legislators urging passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in the original form. In that year, Ernest McFarland again voted yes for the ERA, and Carl Hayden again voted no. There was an article updating the State Federation in the State Magazine about the Equal Rights Amendment by Gertrude Converse. It ended with her recommendation, quote, "Now is the time to start working on candidates for the Arizona State Legislature and make sure we elect women and men who will ratify the Equal Rights Amendment when it is adopted by Congress. If not this session, then before long. It is up to each and every one of our members to put what pressure she can on her own representatives in Washington." In 1950, there was a 3-day debate in the United States Senate about the Equal Rights Amendment. And this is a significant event because it's at this time that Carl Hayden introduced the Hayden Rider to the Equal Rights Amendment. The vote was 63-19, and it passed the Senate for the first time with the Equal Rights Amendment by Carl Hayden attached. However, it died in the House Judiciary Committee. Senator McFarland voted against the Hayden Rider. And what was the Hayden Rider? The Hayden Rider said, quote, "The provisions of this article shall not be construed to impair any rights, benefits, or exemptions now or hereinafter conferred by law upon persons of the female sex," quote. So basically it nullified the whole Equal Rights Amendment. It was an effort, I think, by Carl Hayden to see that protective laws were still going to be allowed for women. But it was immediately opposed by BPW USA, Arizona, and the National Women's Party. I found in the congressional record a quote by Senator Wiley of Wisconsin, and this kind of sums up in a nutshell the opposition to the Hayden Rider. Quote, "With all due respect for my able colleague from Arizona, I feel that the Hayden Amendment is particularly unjustified because he offers in one breath a constitutional change and in the next a direct contradiction of that change. In one paragraph, it would grant women equality, and in a second, it wipes out that equality by granting special benefits and exemptions. The confusion that would result from the Hayden Amendment would becloud all possible actions in the states," end quote. In 1950, there was an interview during National Business Women's Week in Phoenix between Phoenix BPW President Gertrude Converse and National President Sarah T. Hughes. And in that interview, which was broadcast on 8 radio stations, they discussed the Equal Rights Amendment. At another meeting in Phoenix, at which National President Sarah Hughes spoke, she said, quote, "It is time for Arizona to elect 2 senators who will support the Equal Rights Amendment," end quote. By 1953, the state membership was 2,213 women with 43 clubs. In 1953, BPW USA organized Operation Buttonhole for the Equal Rights Amendment, and they allocated $10,000 for their legislative campaign to secure the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. Campaign staff prepared papers on the effects of ERA and sent ERA kits to members of Congress and the media. These kits were also sent nationally to the membership so they could use these kits to buttonhole their representatives during congressional resource and distribute pro-ERA posters, buttons, and sponsor radio spots and organize fundraising activities for ERA. The national magazines supported this effort by publishing articles with titles such as "When You Buttonhole Your Congressman," and another one, "Be Prepared to Act to Achieve Full Citizenship Through the Equal Rights Amendment."
Jan,
Yes.
we're running,
I know. Heidi spoke a bit longer than I did. I'm almost done. Just
Okay.
give me 2 more minutes. I'm almost done. So, any rate, this is in Congress that year. The Equal Rights Amendment was again brought to the floor with only a handful of senators present. The bill was passed with a Hayden Rider attached. And in response, the national organization printed a brochure which was distributed widely to all the BPW members, of which there were 162,615 women, to instruct them to use it to contact their congressmen. The brochure included red-faced elephants and donkeys reading the Republican and Democrat platform papers endorsing the ERA, which was part of their legislative platforms by that time, and gave the exact wording of the ERA amendment and called for passage of the ERA without the amendment. I will skip the final letter I was going to share from Carl Hayden on this subject because it's pretty repetitive, and close by saying that was basically the last significant act during the 50s that happened in Congress for the Equal Rights Amendment. The 1950s ended in 1958 with President Eisenhower asking a joint session of Congress to pass the ERA amendment. He was the first president to endorse it in that form. And in Phoenix in 1959, BPW Arizona organized an ERA debate panel by state legislators, Governor Paul Fannin, the state attorney general at the midwinter board meeting. And as we know, at BPW, we are still working on ratification for the Equal Rights Amendment. BPW USA and Arizona continue to lobby for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, and it is still part of their legislative platform. In closing, I think the best way to close is to share 2 final quotes and let two of these fierce advocates speak, and these are their voices. Estelle Bjerg, 1938, a Phoenix Gazette guest editorial, quote, "Above the portal of the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington is inscribed equal justice under law. The Equal Rights Amendment reduced to 4 words is just that. In a nation that fought overseas for the preservation of democracy, it should not be difficult to secure for its women who constitute approximately half of its citizens and who do not enjoy democracy as long as the law applies, one way to them and another to men. Taxed equally with men, equally amenable to law, and paying the same penalties for its violations, women have fought for 18 years, ever since their enfranchisement, to remove state-by-state laws discriminating against them. There still remain on the statute books more than 1,000 laws discriminating against them on the basics of sex. Even in states where the laws have been to a great degree equalized, each succeeding legislature can return these unjust laws to the statute books. It is like bailing the oceans with a sieve. Equal justice under law does not now apply to women. The proposed Equal Rights Amendment would remedy this injustice," end quote. And finally, Pauline Bates Brown, an editorial in the Arizona Republic, which ended with a paragraph, quote, "It is the inherent right of every American to be born free and equal, but so far that equality applies only to men. American women are not so born, though if it were not for the women, there would be no men who are so born," end quote. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Katie Solon, and she's going to be speaking on behalf of the ERA Task Force Arizona. We try in these symposiums to have a modern issue so that we can relate all of the past to the present. Katie has worked overseas for more than 30 years as U.S. Foreign Service Officer with the UN and NGOs in refugee camps and schools. She's been posted in the Philippines, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Somalia, and Bosnia, Croatia. For the past 17 years, she's been active with Democrats Abroad, whose main mission is to help U.S. citizens abroad register to vote and request overseas ballots. She co-founded the chapter in Austria and served as a DA International Chair from 2013 to 2017. She's now a member of the Democratic National Committee. Through its ERA task force, DA has worked hard to urge state legislators to ratify the ERA and federal leaders to do what is needed to add the ERA to the U.S. Constitution. Thank you.
Well, this has been a fascinating 2 days for me. It's a long time since I was a history major in college, and I have learned over the last hours that I need to go back. I'm not an academic. I'm not the legal expert that you invited here today, Diane Post, who many of you probably know. She is one of the women in Arizona that in 20 or 30 years, the academics are going to be writing about her. However, I am an activist and an organizer around the ERA and other issues. So I'm really happy to be here today. As Melanie said, I've worked overseas, I've lived overseas. I live in Germany now, but I vote in Scottsdale, and I've been here because of COVID for several months. Yeah, I'm going to put up my presentation now. And Jan, thank you for the really detailed, compelling talk that you just gave on the early history of the ERA. I realize that some of the slides that Diane shared with me are probably not necessary. And I'm also not going to be able to take us from the late 50s to today in that level of detail. But let me see if I can share my screen here. I have been working with the ERA Task Force Arizona in the time that I've been here, the last 10 months and before that. And their main work, as you know, is to get Arizona to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So this presentation is about their work, about the current state of affairs around on the federal level and in Arizona as well. And I also, of course, because of my background, I want to add something about the activism around this issue in particular by the tens of thousands of concerned citizens overseas, the hundreds of thousands that are voting, the millions that could vote. So here we go, the Equal Rights Amendment. What's not to like about it? I'm not sure that in all the conversations so far today, anybody really read out what the amendment says, but the first section is simply this in the bolded letters. The equality of rights under the law shall not be I can't see, denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of sex. It's pretty simple. What is not to like about it? The history, I don't know much more than what's on this slide. And you can see that in the first half of this slide, Jan gave us an excellent presentation. But for anybody who needs a little bit of a refresher, we know that it was introduced written by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman in 1923, introduced by Charles Curtis and Daniel Anthony. Went where it went. I'm not going to repeat through the 50s, but finally in the late 60s and the early 70s, momentum picked up again for women's rights across the board following the civil rights movement. You can go back and look at Representative Shirley Chisholm, a freshman congressperson from New York, and her landmark speech, which was really compelling. No reason to allow prejudice to, do need to move this picture somewhere, to be enshrined in our laws to perpetuate injustice, and that sex prejudice cuts both ways. In 1970, the amendment finally comes out of committee. In October 1971, it passes the US House. In May 1972, it passes the US Senate. And importantly, after it passes, the 7-year deadline is added to the preamble of the amendment. Many states quickly ratify. It takes Hawaii only 30 minutes to get that done over the next few years. And then ratifications begin to slow. Much of this by different women's groups, and especially Phyllis Schlafly, whose name I did not spell properly, even though I live in Germany. As you know, she was the anti-feminist organizer who who felt that this amendment would damage American families and the special status that women do or did enjoy. The deadline was set for 1979. In 1978, it was extended 5 years until, sorry, that would only be 3 years until 1982. By 1982, 35 states had ratified. This was 3 short of the 38 that were needed. None were ratified between 1979 and 1982. Again, you know, the ebb and flow, the flow going down. And then around 2015, there is really renewed interest. The ERA coalition and other groups begin to fight for the ERA again. In March 2017, Nevada ratifies as the 36th state. In May 2018, Illinois ratifies, the 37th. And then finally, in January 2020, Virginia makes it 38 by ratifying the amendment. And then what happened? Then what happened was the Trump administration, the Department of Justice under the former president, sent a letter to the National Archivist instructing him to not add it to the Constitution or publish it because the deadline had passed. So that's the history bringing us up to date. So what happened in Arizona in this time period? Well, in 1972, Sandra Day O'Connor tries to get Arizona to ratify. In 75 and 79, Sister Claire Dunn does as well. In the 80s and 90s, the bill was introduced in the Arizona state legislature off and on. Since 2000, it has been introduced every year in both houses. In 2018, it was first assigned to a committee. It has never been assigned to an agenda. In 2017 and 28, there were some maneuvers on the floor that looked like possibly it would be brought to a vote. It never was. 2019, a motion to discharge, again, not brought to a vote. And then finally, much work was done in 2019 and in 2020 to produce a different result in the elections, having the legislature in the control of the Republican Party by just 1 or 2 seats in both houses. And there was a big move to try to flip the legislature in order to make ERA, for many people who were working on this, to make ERA one of the priorities and to have it ratified early in 2021. That did not happen. So where are we in 2021? In Arizona, the bill was introduced and it died in committee in both houses. All right. So looking across the country and then specifically in Arizona, about what do people think about the ERA? Well, there was an ABA poll in 2020 that asked, do you strongly agree, disagree, agree, or disagree? And as you can see with the green and the turquoise parts of this pie chart, it's 48% strongly agree and 34% agree. So overwhelming majority of people in the country think that the ERA makes sense and should be passed. In Arizona, the OH Predictive Insight poll shows something of the same story. It shows that the awareness, I guess it shows that people are in favor when they're aware, but it does show that one of the biggest problems is people aren't aware that it's even being considered. Many people, when they're interviewed on the street, do not realize that it hasn't passed yet. So in this poll, it shows that in Arizona, 27% of the people surveyed would be in favor. Are aware, this is the awareness slide. 27% only are aware that this was even being debated in the state legislature. 54% didn't know that it was being debated, and 20% didn't even know perhaps that they didn't know. So now looking at the support, among the people sampled in Arizona in support of the amendment that it should be added to the Constitution, 63% of voters in Arizona, 19% opposed, and 19% undecided or didn't know. You can look at the support by gender and also by political party. In this slide, you can see that by gender, I'm sorry, I'm losing my place in my notes here, but you'll probably be as fast as I am. In the first two columns, females are supporting the amendment 64% and males 61%. Opposed, again, 15% of the women, 22% of the men. And then don't know is a relatively big number, 20% of the women and 17% of the men. And if you jump to the right side of this graph, you'll see that even though the support for this amendment, as it has ebbed and flowed, has also switched from party to party, now there seems to be quite a difference. Democrats support 79%, independents 69%, and Republicans 44%. Those who are opposed, Democrats only 8%, independents 13%, and then 32% of Republicans are opposed and when this poll was taken in 2019. And then for undecided or don't know, for Democrats 13%, independents 18%, and Republicans 24%. I'm not going to go through the slide on ages. What I am going to talk about now is what are the activists to do? What are the voters to do? What are the people to do now about passing the ERA? There seem to be 5 ideas floating around. The first is to extend or to do away with the ratification deadline. The second is to pursue this issue in the courts, and 2 lawsuits have been filed and are pending in one way or another. The third option here would be for the National Archivist to simply add it to the Constitution. We'll go over that in a minute. The fourth would be to start over again and ask the states to all begin ratifying again with either a new deadline or no deadline. And then a final idea that is now being considered and being fought for in a number of states is to add the ERA or something similar to state constitutions. So I'll talk briefly about each one of these ideas. The first, the deadline extension or removal. It should be clear that this is completely up to Congress. The deadline is not part of the amendment as it was passed. It was added later, not to the amendment, but to the preamble that describes the amendment. Article 5 of the Constitution talks about amending the Constitution, but it does not talk about setting deadlines to ratify. Then importantly, the Constitution does state that one Congress cannot bind a future Congress. So the current Congress, has the ability to act. Bills to remove the deadline were introduced in both houses in January 21st, 2021. It passed in the House on March 17th and introduced by bipartisan Republican Senator Murkowski from Alaska and Ben Cardin from Maryland. Expect, and there's a misspelled introduced, I see. Yeah, expect action in August, which of course with the suffrage celebration or anniversary coming up in that month would be a good month. Yeah, we don't know what is going to be happening in the Senate. We know that it's a hard pull at this time, but we know that there already are most of the Democrats and a handful of Republicans who are willing to back removing the deadline. So the second option now to get this as part of the Constitution are the 2 lawsuits that were filed in the last year, 18 months. And the first was filed in federal court in Boston. It was a number of groups, including Equal Means Equal versus, I think it's David Ferrario, but the National Archivist. And this suit was dismissed due to the plaintiffs' plural, lack of standing. And in October 2020, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. The second case was filed in the federal court in Washington, D.C., and this was the attorneys general of Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, the last 3 states to ratify, who sued demanding that because 38 states have ratified, the archivist should add the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. There were many amicus briefs written by many different groups that support the ERA. In March 2021, a judge ruled that the 82 deadline should hold and that the AGs have no standing. At least one of the attorney generals from Virginia has stated that he will appeal. And this is a case that eventually could go to the Supreme Court. Third option, get the archivist to publish the amendment. In 2020, the then DOG sent a letter to the National Archivist, again, telling him that the 82 deadline was valid and enforceable, and he didn't act. New York Representative Carolyn Maloney and others have contacted President Biden and Vice President Harris, asking the Biden administration to reverse this DOG position. And so we're waiting to see what action will Merrick Garland's Department of Justice take. Starting over, this is an option. In February 2020, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in an interview at Georgetown Law School, very publicly talked about there being too much controversy over whether truly 3/4 of the states had ratified. She did say, if you count a latecomer on the plus side, how can you disregard states that said we've changed our mind? And there are 5 states who have talked about rescinding their ratification. On that, and a side note on that, there is also provisions in precedent that do not allow subsequent legislatures to undo ratification that previous legislatures have voted on. The response to Ruth Bader Ginsburg from Linda Coberly of the ERA Coalition is that the reasons for counting latecomers are separate from the reasons for not taking into account subsequent votes by legislatures purporting to rescind. There are 2 different legal opinions that would be required here. And it is really not known how RBG or any of the justices would decide the case if it came before the court. Another of the options that is being discussed in many, many groups around the US is adding, instead of to the US Constitution, adding the ERA or some other text to state constitutions. In Arizona, in our discussions with the ERA Task Force Arizona and among Democrats Abroad Global Women's Caucus, it seems that the chances of getting such a amendment to the state constitution would be as great or as small as ratifying the 28th Amendment. And that would be 0 at present. So if you want to look at the control of state legislatures and then think about those polls that talked about which of the parties that seem to be more in favor and which party seems not to be, this also gives you an idea of what could be the success or failure rate in different state legislatures. In the state senates across the US, 18 are now controlled by Democrats and 32 by the Republican Party. State houses, 19 Democrat, 29 Republican, and 1 mixed. And then trifectas, where it's the easiest situation to pass any kind of legislation where you hold both chambers plus the governorship. There are 15 Democratic and 23 Republican. So I think that this has been talked about over this weekend quite a bit, but why? What is even, what is worth this effort? What difference will the ERA make? And the first and foremost is, final constitutional equality for a group of people that was intentionally left out when the Constitution was drafted originally. The ERA would elevate the standard of analysis in courts to strict scrutiny. And this is the kind of scrutiny that is the highest standard. And right now it is used only for race, for cases of discrimination based on race, color, national origin, and religion. The standard now for sexual discrimination cases is intermediate scrutiny, not so high. Once in the Constitution, the ERA could not be ignored or repealed easily. It would apply to both men and women, And there are many issues that it would impact, could impact: violence against women, pay equality, maternity leave, abortion. Although that one, it seems to be very murky. The Supreme Court has already held up abortion rights without the ERA as part of the Constitution, and they have used privacy rights in the Constitution rather than equality rights. So there are many people who also say that the ERA would have no impact on these decisions. And then finally, I'm going to get to the work of the ERA Task Force Arizona. Its mission is to get Arizona to ratify the ERA. It's made up of groups and individuals. It cooperates with the National Organization of Women, the League of Women Voters, Vote Equality, the ERA Coalition, and any other group who has this common goal. In November 2020, I really need to go through these slides. The task force supported 4 candidates and then a 5th in the end for state legislative races. And they really did a lot of hard work, highlighting them at events, making phone calls, writing postcards, really reaching out in their districts, hoping that these 5 women would get elected, flip the legislature, and ratify the ERA. These 5 women were up in the Flagstaff area: Coral Evans, Felicia French, and around here in Phoenix, Kathy Connect and Sharon Gerard. And the only one who won was the 5th. She was also really supported by NOW, and that is Judy Schweikert. The task force has also done a lot of education. They're speaking at schools and events, looking for opportunities at all times. They are doing advocacy work, providing during the legislative session before COVID, sentinels at the Capitol every day, setting up a table, providing information to legislators and anyone else who's around the state capitol, giving info packets to legislators, and then holding end of session legislative events, bringing in as many people as they can to bring awareness of the ERA. They have a great website. They're on Facebook, Twitter. They participate in rallies and events, and in all of these ways try to both raise awareness and persuade people to support the ERA. ERA activists overseas. The Women's Caucus of Democrats Abroad has an ERA task force. Our main goal is to promote adding this amendment to the US Constitution and state constitutions. We are all about research, advocacy, education, and communication. I'm going to get more to in another slide about really who we are. But just to tell you first what we've been about. We've been contacting US senators in the states where we vote, and also in states where we don't vote. We have all kinds of people that are from a state that's already ratified, and they're helping in the states that haven't yet ratified. A lot of cross-border cooperation. We've been on the Hill door knocking on issues of concern to overseas voters, and this is one of them, so we include it in our door knocking package on the Hill. We've collected stories and photos and videos from US citizens abroad and put them into book form and delivered them to Congress with the organization Vote Equality. We've had watch parties all over the world, in person and on Zoom, to watch the film Legalize Equality and discuss it. We've written letters to editors of local papers in the US. We've joined petition drives, and we did an amazing job to get out the overseas vote in 2020, hoping to elect candidates that would ratify. And we had a 40% increase in 2020 from 2016. Being the only group overseas that is really, in a nonpartisan way, helping voters, this was an amazing achievement. In the state level, some of the same activities. We've sent videos to state legislative leaders, these same booklets, collecting stories from overseas voters. We've had postcard campaigns, letters to editors, emails, call storms, again, get out the vote activities, voter registration, and get out the vote. And then in some places, we've encouraged city councilors and other local officials to pass resolutions in their local area. So the overseas vote, every one of you knows somebody who lives overseas, a family, friend, neighbor, colleague. Good chances are that person is not voting, but there are 9 million Americans living outside the US. according to the State Department. 6.5 million are of voting age. And we, US military and civilians abroad, have had the right to vote absentee since 1976. Estimates of Arizonans abroad, Arizonians, is around 100,000. 20,000 voted in November 2020, which was up 40% from 2016. And if you remember how tight the margins were in Arizona, you'll know that the overseas vote was really critical this year. It provided the margins, or more than the margins, in the presidential race in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, and helped out in a number of the other states where the races were close. About 80% of overseas Americans don't vote. Why don't they vote? Number one, they don't know they can. They don't know how. They must send in a ballot request every year. You don't get on any automatic list. You need to reach out to your county official every year. Think about that. If every voter in the US had to re-register every year, what our numbers would look like. Many voters miss the deadlines because they're not aware in time. Many states require the voter to use the postal mail system in the United States or in the country where they live, or both, I guess. And this can be a disaster in any year. It was really a terrible thing for many voters during the COVID time when mail systems shut down. They can fail or just be slow so that you miss deadlines. And then the deadlines and laws really vary quite a bit from state to state, so it can be confusing. But why do Americans want to vote? Well, number one is, love of their country, of their home country, of still feeling connected, which gets easier and easier to do as we are all becoming digital. We have concern for our families and friends and our colleagues back home. Many of us plan to return at some point. We are very aware of how US politics and policies affect not just the US, but the rest of the world. And we are passionate about issues like the ERA. We are liable to file and pay US taxes. If you're a male between the ages of 18 and how old? My son from Germany just arrived today. So I think it's in the 30s, mid 30s, right? You need to register for the draft. Currently in Arizona, it's relatively easy to vote from abroad, much easier than in about 20 other states. The number one reason is because we have electronic transmission of voting materials. We can apply for the ballot by email. We can receive the blank ballot by email, download, print it, and then we can return it, either as an upload to the state's website or as an attachment on an email or by fax. We're not one of those states that require a hard copy to be mailed from, some small country in Africa or even Central Asia or Eastern Europe where the mail really wasn't working this year. The second good thing about voting from abroad to Arizona is that we have late deadlines. The deadline to request your ballot actually is election day. So you have that whole month before when people are really getting spun up about voting to get this done. Other states have a deadline that is 2, 3, 4 weeks out before election day. In Arizona, we have an extended deadline for mailed ballots from abroad. They can arrive up to 3 days after election day. The ID requirements are reasonable. A notary is no longer required in most states, and it's not required in Arizona. And Arizona, Maricopa County anyway, which holds 60% of our voters, has an excellent ballot tracking system where you can really figure out, is the ballot on its way to you? Has it been received? Has it been certified? Has it been tabulated? You can see all of that on the Maricopa County website. And then a last slide here is to talk about Democrats abroad. We are officially part of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has 57 state parties. It has the 50 states plus DC, Democrats abroad, and the 5 territories. We have 200,000 members in 190 countries right now, 45 robust country committees, and our main work is nonpartisan voter registration and assistance. We've made this all easier and more understandable, especially if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, the website tool that we developed votefromabroad.org. Doesn't matter what country you live in, it doesn't matter what state you vote in, you can use that tool. It doesn't matter what political party you prefer. You can use that tool to get your ballot, to register to vote and get your ballot and ask questions at a 24/7 helpline. We have a number of caucuses that have grown over the last 4 years in particular. So many issues to be concerned about. We have an Asian American Pacific Islander caucus, a Black caucus, a Hispanic caucus. These are all new in the last 4 years. Progressive, vets and military families. And then we have 3 caucuses that we've had for decades. The LGBTQ caucus, the Women's Caucus, and the Youth Caucus. And finally, I get to our task force on the ERA. This is a part, an action team on our global Women's Caucus, which by now in the last 4 years, a lot of women's activity over the last 4 years has grown to 10,000 members around the world. We think that this is most likely the biggest American women's organization in the outside the United States. So you can find out more about Democrats Abroad at our website, and you can look at our voting tool again if you go to votefromabroad.org.
Marcel Proust, an early 20th century French novelist and essayist, wrote, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." History gives us the opportunity to explore past events, to ask new questions, to discover, to see familiar landscapes with new eyes, to feel a sense of connection to those who came before us and to our contemporaries. It cultivates an understanding of and appreciation for the endless variety in the ways that people and societies live. I hope that throughout this symposium that you've had that feeling that you've been able to look at things with new eyes. Mary is a professor emerita of women and gender studies at ASU, where she specialized in the history of American women and feminism, women's oral history, and gender equality in education. All of her teaching used gender as a primary lens to analyze society and to understand the intersection of race and class in American society. Her publications include A Case of Black and White, Northern Volunteers in the Southern Freedom Summers, 1964 to 1965, and Doing What the Day Brought, an oral history of Arizona women. I'm going to cut her introduction short. We will still end here at 12:40 if people are still interested in having conversations. So Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
I've really enjoyed every single presentation. I was particularly struck with Katie's, partly because my older son has lived overseas with his family for the last 25 years and has always managed to vote, but sometimes it's been really hard. Their home base is Minnesota, which makes it easier than some states, but not others. I thought what Jan told us and Heidi told us about politics once women in Arizona get the vote, and various groups, including the General Federation of Women's Clubs and BPW, how they continue to organize women even once suffrage is well established in the state, is a history that not nearly enough people in the state know. When I did the oral history project that ended up with Arizona Women Doing What the Day Brought, because which was funded by the Arizona Humanities Council. It was the first time they allowed themselves to fund an oral history project. We did 13 readers' theaters around the state, a slide tape show, and then Ronick and I did the book. I did that because Arizona history was required for all students in the state of Arizona, once in middle school and once in high school. And there were 2 textbooks. This is when my children were in school. So in the 80s and 70s and 80s, in the 80s really mostly, there were 2 certified textbooks for Arizona history. The first one had 1 sentence on Arizona women, 1 sentence. The second book increased it by 100% because it had 2 sentences. Literally, that was it. It was a required course. There was absolutely no mention of what women did except the 2 sentences which talked about sort of scandalous women who were prostitutes and bar girls. I got so angry about this because I'm a Western woman from Washington, 4th generation from Washington State. I actually moved east to come to Arizona. And I knew, and I lived on a farm, and I knew what women had done to make the West. And so I became extremely committed to changing the view of Arizona women, and was lucky enough to have a series of graduate students at Arizona State University, including Mary Melcher, Melanie, who were very interested in looking at women's history in the West. So all of that has been covered today. I have lots of questions I could ask about the ERA, and I guess one of them, if people want to weigh in, would be to ask if the ERA is necessary today. Why wouldn't a sweeping 14th Amendment decision, which was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's strategy when she was head of the Women's Law Project for the ACLU, and she gets within 1 Supreme Court vote of strict admission in the Frontiero case. I've had a lot of arguments with people now who think the ERA is really superfluous. Women really have the ability to have equal rights, and really it's not a big deal anymore. I obviously disagree with them, but I think there aren't so many people who are fundamentally opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment anymore, but as Katie's slides showed, those polls showed, but they just don't, it's not a burning issue for them. The day I was offered my position at Arizona State University in 1975, and I told my students at the University of Puget Sound that I was taking it and I was moving to Arizona, that very day, the Equal Rights Amendment came up before the Arizona State Legislature, and 8 of the 13 women legislators voted against it. And that was on the front page of the Tacoma News Tribune. And I came to my office the next day, and my students had cut up about 50 copies of the TNT and with that article and pasted it all over my door with a big sign, "Why are you leaving us to go to Arizona?" And where 8 of 13 women voted against the Equal Rights Amendment. And I've never forgotten that. I told them I was going because maybe there was work for me to do there. And I like to think that that has been true. I think the best thing would be to open up to questions for the panelists, because really they're who you want to hear from. So can we have some questions in the chat?
Oh, sorry. Shirley Muni asked Katie if she could talk to them more about the film that you were discussing.
I cannot talk very much more about the film, but I can dig up the link to it. It is again called Legalize Equality. It's about a half an hour long, and it is about the struggle for the ERA. I'm not sure how you access it in the US. The organization that made it gave us special privileges to show it around the world in any kind of a house party setting, which included in people's homes and on Zoom calls with 30 to 300 people. So I can provide the link to Melody. I don't know if you're going to be sending out any documents after this. I hope so. I would love to have a copy of everybody's presentation, but I can make sure that I get to Melanie how you can access that in the US so that you can watch it. Again, the title is Legalize Equality, and it's excellent.
Thank you. Oops. All right. Thank you, Christine Rhodes, for your nice comment about the symposium. Let's see, Christine Marin is asking, it says, hello, Mary, are you the first female faculty member in the history department to be hired with a tenure line?
Well, that's a, believe it or not, a more complicated question than I think Chris realizes. There was a woman in the history department when I was hired, Retha Warnicki, who Chris knows well, who did Tudor Stuart England. But she started as an adjunct lecturer, but by 1975, she had been given a tenure line and actually got tenure in 1975, the year I was hired. So I was not, and she, although her subject was Tudor Stuart England, was asked to teach a women's history course the year before, American women's history, which she gamely did. And it was so well received that the department decided to hire a women's historian, and I was the person they chose. So I was the first woman hired initially on a tenure track line, but I wasn't the first tenured woman in the history department because Retha had become so important to the department that they switched her from this adjunct temporary lecturer line to a tenure track line, and she had just received tenure. She's a brilliant scholar, a women's historian of the English Renaissance, and she's published zillions more books than I have, all to rave reviews. I recommend her work very strongly. There weren't many women at the university, though, that I want to be very clear about. And we were known, both Retha and I, but especially I, was known as a, quote, public feminist. That's my phrase. So students came to us from all kinds of other departments because they knew we were pro-women. And when I had to leave from the National Endowment for the Humanities to do work on a book on Girl Scouts, my replacement, I went in to see her a couple of months after the school year began, and she looked at me with her eyes like this and said, do you have stock in Kleenex? And I said, no. She said, well, you ought to, because I can't believe the number of students who come and then they ask to close the door and then they burst into tears about a rape or discrimination. And it's hard to imagine, to remember what it was like in universities as late as 1975 to 1980, because that has changed so profoundly. Mary Melcher writes that she's impressed by the need for persistence related to suffrage in the ERA. Do any of the panelists want to comment on how women have been able to continue despite so many defeats? Jan and Katie, weigh in.
Well, I would weigh in because in my notes, my introduction, I wanted to refer to the end of Melanie's talk when she told us just that. She was talking about suffrage, but she, these are just critical points. Grassroots does have power. It did to get the vote. It does for so many other issues. We are seeing it as people are out in the streets, in the last 4 to 5 years like they've never been before, but around the ERA. She talked about every movement has brick walls and you have to keep going. She talked about the importance of coalitions, about persistence, and that learning from history so that we don't divide when we have a common goal. And then finally, the intersection, between local and national groups. So for any kind of change, societal change, time is needed, persistence is needed. And you just have to keep going. You hit those brick walls and then you look at another way to go about it. But That's what our history is teaching us. That's what you guys have been telling us over the last 8 or 9 hours, haven't you? And we activists are, taking it to heart.
I would add just to that, one thing that struck me, Katie, in your talk was that ERA activists still are using some of the strategies, right, that the suffragists use, like the sentinels in front of the Capitol, and a lot of these kind of different ways of organizing, helping people, educating them on the process, right? And so that struck me as this continuity that we can learn from strategies that worked in the past, and obviously use new technologies, right? The web is so new. And then that, that emphasis on persistence that you mentioned, I think that's so important. I think about some of the women. So I didn't write about Mary Church Terrell. She's an African-American suffragist, but Allison Parker just published a really fantastic biography of her. And, she's president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in like the 1890s and early 20th. And she continues to advocate for Black women's right to vote, right, past 1920 into the 30s and 40s. And she's doing sit-ins and boycotts in Washington, D.C. of segregated restaurants in the 1950s. And she dies in 1954. So she sees Brown v. Board. But I think about, right, her entire life was persisting in advocating for these rights. And she sees some of the fruition of that, but knowing that a decade later, the Voting Rights Act would happen. I think we can take heart from those histories as well.
I want to echo your two comments, but the point that I was trying to make in my talk, which I think I probably failed to make because I got so stressed out with being disconnected, was that I believe it was the joint women lawyers between the National Women Lawyers Association and BPW that helped position BPW so well to lobby for the Equal Rights Amendment. And I think collaboration is the key to success as well as organization. But I think that one of the biggest obstacles, which Katie referred to, that women face today is the lack of education. The younger women just think that the ERA got ratified and they see no value for it. And Mary Rothschild's comment about, is it even still relevant? Why shouldn't we do the 14th Amendment? That's another interesting point.
That's a kind of fake question in a way, because it's so hard. And with the current Supreme Court, there's no way we'd get a strict decision that mandated, like Brown, that mandates that essentially the burden of proof shifts when you get that level. And, if Ruth Bader Ginsburg couldn't get it with Frontiero all those years ago, it's very unlikely with this court we'd ever get a sweeping 14th Amendment, although my Republican brother constantly says, you don't need the ERA if we've got the 14th Amendment. And then I, smack him verbally, and that's the end of that conversation. But in a theoretical sense, the 14th Amendment should cover it. But in actuality, it doesn't.
If discrimination was gone, we wouldn't need it. But it isn't. Things have improved, but what kind of backsliding is around the corner? And, the mention of is it Terrell is the last name of the Mary Church Terrell?
Church Terrell.
That she didn't get to see the Voting Rights Act come about in the 60s. She also didn't get to see 50 years later when the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court. And she didn't get to see the 250 voter suppression bills that have been introduced in 43 states over the last 18 months. So there is, it's more than an ebb and flow. There is backsliding that is either happening or waiting to happen. And the ERA would help to put a stop to that.
I don't think she'd be surprised by those things, but you're right, she didn't see them.
And so maybe the addition to that is, so our work continues, because some of those bills will pass, and then we will have to win elections in those very states where it will be much more difficult for every eligible voter to vote, we still will have to go there and work and turn out the people to vote so that we can then change those laws. So yeah, the work goes on.
Always, alas. And in Arizona, some of those, we had 43 laws for changing voting issues, and several of them did pass. The worst one failed, but only by one vote. And that was the one that said, if the voters of the state of Arizona elect a slate of electors for the presidency, that the majority, that the state legislature disapproves of, the state legislature can put its own state set of electors in. I mean, that would have completely nullified, I mean, it would never have stood up in court, but it would have completely nullified the vote if the state legislature were, for instance, Republican and the state had voted Democrat, which is exactly what happened this year. I mean, last year.
I think an interesting point that came up, I believe it was in Katie's talk, was sort of, that at the local and state level, right, those offices really matter too. We often see the push for those presidential elections, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but right, the importance of all of the elections. Like we have a primary for our local county or city borough in May, right? And just the way that those elections sometimes catch you off guard because they're not the ones that get all the attention, but they're so key. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in Arizona, in Maricopa County, I mean, in my legislative district, we flipped it completely, and I worked very hard on that from 2012 to 2016, completely flipped it. But at the county level, and Maricopa County is the fourth biggest county in the United States. I mean, it's at the heart of all of Arizona politics, and it used to be overwhelmingly Republican, and now it's not. The down ballot races did not go well for Democrats, even though there was an incredibly high turnout. So yeah, local. I've become a big proponent of the importance of working on local races much more than I used to be. I used to be much more involved in national politics. But seeing Katie Hobbs start this whole conference was wonderful because she has been a superb Secretary of State, and she really ran a tight ship in the 2020 election. So I think we're at 12:40, but I don't.
Mary, can I add one just little point, because I have a piece of paper here on my desk. I looked this up yesterday. I've lived 35 years away, in many other countries. In the main countries where I lived, the ERA or some similar text went into the Constitution in the Philippines in 1987, the first time, in Austria in the 70s, in El Salvador in 2011, in Croatia when they became their own country in 1990, and in Germany in 1949. Let's catch up with the rest of the world.
Well, yes, I couldn't agree more. I think, however, that part of what happened with the ERA for so long was that warrior women who worked for women's rights were opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment because it would overturn Mueller versus Oregon, which set up protective legislation. And it's really important to understand that because we did not have socialism, we did not have a strong union movement in the United States, Mueller versus Oregon was incredibly important to improving women's lives. So you have people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins. You couldn't get more devoted people fundamentally opposed to the ERA, and that lasted for a long time. And it wasn't stupid. it really, Mueller versus Oregon, the right to have protective legislation really did make a difference in working women's lives. No question about it for a long time. And it was a kind of uniquely American disaster for equal rights, which didn't exist, certainly not in Germany or other countries where they had a strong governmental and union background that didn't see itself destroyed because of equal rights. So that legacy, I think a lot of people don't understand because that held on for a long time. I mean, John Kennedy was completely opposed to the ERA, for instance. So I don't know what we're supposed to do right now. Oh, there's
Okay,
Melanie.
Mary. I did ask a question, and if both of these people are still here, they can answer it in a short time. But I was really interested in knowing whether Heidi and Jan are going to write and publish articles about the things they talked about today.
I already have, Melanie. It's
Thank
in my
you.
book and in my dissertation. I just lifted it right out of there. So yeah, all the legislative stuff has been done, like I said.
I guess
And
I was thinking about the African American women in Phoenix.
yes, I do think, like I said, there's a lot of bits and pieces that individuals have done on Black women's clubs, but I think we need to bring them all together in a way, but that's gonna wait for the archives to reopen.
Yeah.
Jan?
Good.
Anything that I wanted to add to this paper today so much, but with everything closed down, you are just shut out of a lot of material right now. And that's why I had to regurgitate stuff that's 20 years old.
I wouldn't
Jan?
say it's just regurgitation, Heidi.
Oh, no. I do think that is a potential, and that looking, like Mary said it too, looking at city council's local politics is, I think, for most women in politics, approaching the state legislature, approaching Congress to change laws was very frightening. It was intimidating. And for most women's groups, they rather attack problems at the local level where they knew local politicians, and they went to city councils and commissioners and other organizations to change things in those early days. And I think that was where a lot of the action actually took place.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that if any of you are interested in the ERA in Arizona, in the 70s, when I was a state archivist, I was looking around for oral histories of women and men that participated in that and couldn't find any. So I asked Carol Palmer, who was a graduate student doing research in the women after the 50s, if she'd be interested in doing an oral history project for us. And unfortunately, we only got 20 interviews, but they're amazing. They're at the state archives if you ever want to go and look at them. So I just want to thank all of you for participating, though even this has been really a wonderful thing. And I want to thank Mary Rothschild and Mary Melcher, because they are the scholars who helped me put this together, and I'm really grateful for all their work. And thank you, all of you. Derek has been able to save all the questions in chat. So we should be able to post the website that Kathleen put here. We could probably post on our Facebook page if anyone's interested in looking at that. And if you don't like Facebook, we'll put it on our Arizona Women's History Alliance website. So again, thank you all so much. This has been really wonderful. We are going to be posting the symposium on our newly formed Arizona Women's History Alliance YouTube channel. So these will be available for other people to look at. So again, thank you so much.